Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to embark on Module 7, in the course of which we shall hear evidence from a number of different expert witnesses relating to various aspects of the matters we've been investigating in previous modules. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, good morning. This morning we're going to start with the topic of smoke control, and we're going to be hearing from two experts over the next 2 days, Mr. Simon Lay today and Dr. Barbara Lane tomorrow.
Thank you.
So if I could call Mr. Simon Lay, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Mr. Lay.
Good morning.
I understand you're going to affirm.
Correct, yes.
And the words are on the screen. Would you read them out, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Good. Thank you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and thank you very much, Mr. Lay, for attending the inquiry today to assist us with our work. It's very much appreciated. I'm going to be asking you the questions today. If you don't understand any of my questions, please just ask me to repeat the point or I'll put it in a different way. And if you can also keep your voice up and nice and clear for the transcriber who's sitting to your right, that's also much appreciated. Now, you prepared a report in August 2001. If we go to that report now, it's at LAY 701. There we can see it's dated the 6th of August 2021. And we can see that this report focuses on the smoke control system installed at Grenfell Tower. And if we go on within it to page 13, paragraph 3, we can see you say in the first lines there that this report's been prepared as an independent expert review of the smoke control system installed as part of the refurbishment project at the tower. And you go on to tell us that your instructions came from Shoesmiths LLP solicitors who act for PSB UK Limited, and they are one of the core participants to the inquiry, yes?
That's correct, yeah.
And it's right, isn't it, that it was PSB who had an involvement in designing and commissioning the smoke control system, albeit they didn't install it themselves?
That's my understanding, yes.
Yeah. And following the provision of this report, the inquiry has decided to call you to give oral evidence on this topic. And we'll, as I said earlier, we'll be hearing from you today and then from Dr. Barbara Lane on the same topic tomorrow. Now, in terms of the content of your report, if we could go to the introduction at page 22, and we can see in paragraph 2, you say that this report considers the smoke control system during the refurbishment project, which concluded in mid-2016, and it also looks at the operation of the system during the fire in the early hours of the 14th of June 2017, when the Grenfell Tower fire occurred. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And then at paragraph 17 on page 25, you just list briefly the areas you've been asked to comment on, and they are the legislation and guidance relating to the system, the approach taken in designing, installing and commissioning the system, with reference to what I would expect in a project of the type undertaken at Grenfell Tower, and then assist in clarifying how compliance with relevant legislation is evaluated for smoke control systems, and comment on the system in that regard. Was that the main work that you undertook in preparing this report?
Yes, it was.
And you tell us also at paragraph 18 that you were also asked to comment on the approach taken and the conclusions drawn by Dr. Barbara Lane and Ms. Beryl Menzies in their respective reports, which have also considered the smoke control system or the building control process in respect of it, yes?
Yes.
And then if I take you to the final section of your report on page 475, we can see there's certain declarations and a statement of truth which continues over the page. And if we look at that, is that your signature there?
It is my signature, yes.
Thank you. And you've prepared 2 errata corrections reports as well. There's I'll just give the transcript references. That's at LAY 702 and LAY 704. And you've also prepared a further statement dated the 31st of May 2022. If we could just bring that up. That's at LAY 703. So this is a statement that you served on the inquiry last week, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
And if we could go to the final page in this statement, there again, is that your signature?
It is, yes.
And have you provided your report and your recent statement in the same way that you would have provided a report or a statement to a court?
Yes, I have, yes.
Now, any matters of law within your reports will ultimately be matters for the chairman and the panel to decide, but can you confirm that the factual matters set out in your report and in your statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
And does your report and your statement, do they represent your true and complete professional opinion on the matters addressed within them?
Yes, they do.
Thank you. Now, just some questions about your qualifications and your background. If we can go back to your main report and look at page 25, please. This is section C of your report, which starts in the middle of that page, headed My Experience, and you provide us with a summary of your experience and qualifications, and then a copy of your full CV appears later at the end of your report. Now, in paragraph 21, you tell us that you're a chartered engineer specialising in fire engineering. Does that remain the case?
Yes, it is.
And your chartership is through, your registration is through the Institute of Fire Engineers, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you've held that since October 2009, is that right?
Yes, I think so, yeah.
Yeah, that's what you tell us in your CV. And you also tell us in that paragraph that you are a professional member of the Society of Fire Protection Engineers and a fellow of the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, is that correct?
Yes.
And that was an independent peer-reviewed title for which you were nominated based on your contribution to the fire safety design of tall buildings. Is that
Correct.
right?
Yes.
And you also tell us that you were appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts in recognition of the contribution you've made to positive social change through your work in fire engineering.
Yes.
Is that correct? Now, in terms of your qualifications, at the end of paragraph 21 there, that last sentence we can see on the page, you tell us that you hold a Bachelor of Engineers degree in aeronautical engineering. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And you tell us in your CV that you obtained that from the University of Manchester between 1989 and 1992.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And then if we go to page 453 of this report, we can see your career history is summarised helpfully in this table. So we can see that after university, you spent some time so it starts, if we look at the bottom of the table to begin with and go up. So you were a research assistant at the University of Manchester, and then you worked as sometime as a commissioning engineer at Sizewell B. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah. I was doing some research work at the university, and then I got a job as a commissioning engineer. Correct, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a nuclear facility.
Yes, it is, a nuclear power station in Suffolk.
Yeah. And then you spent some more time as a research assistant, and then we can see that you became a senior fire engineer for Warrington Fire between 1995 and 1998. So did you go straight into the position of senior fire engineer at Warrington Fire, or did you make your way up to that position?
Yeah, so that's the position I was at when I left Warrington Fire. So
Right.
I think I joined, might have been a graduate position, or it might have been fire engineer. I can't remember the exact title, if I'm honest. I think it might have been graduate, they called us. Mhm.
Yeah. So is that where you began to obtain fire engineering skill and expertise?
I actually started when I was at BNFL as a safety assessor. I was mainly doing safety cases for the decommissioning of legacy nuclear facilities, and the big hazard in those is fire. So I learned to use some of the tools that a fire engineer uses before realising actually that fire engineering even existed as a discipline.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And after you left Warrington Fire, we can see that you were then at Arup as an associate fire engineer between 1999 and 2001, yes?
Yes.
And then you spent quite a long time at WSP between January 2002 and December 2011. And that position of Director of Fire Engineering and Leader of Specialist Engineering, was that the position you were in at the end of the time at WSP?
Yes, it was, yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. So again, did you work your way up as a fire engineer at WSP?
I think I joined, again, I think the title when I joined was Associate Fire Engineer.
Yeah.
And then, there was only a couple of people in the team, and we grew the team, and then I ended up leading not just the fire engineers, but the whole specialist team, and having a director position.
And was there any particular speciality you had while you were at WSP?
I think the area that we really focused on was tall buildings. WSP at the time, and I think still is the leading designer of tall buildings, certainly in this country, with a lot of global experience. So I was very fortunate to join them just as we were rediscovering tall buildings in this country. We had a bit of a hiatus for about 30 years, and then we came back to designing them. And WSP brought a lot of expertise through a company they bought in America. It also worked in the Far East as well. So they had this continuous work they'd done in tall building design. So I was very fortunate to learn from people who had been designing tall buildings for a very long time.
Yeah. And then we can see you went to AECOM as Director of Fire Engineering, January 2012 to January 2016. Did you hold that position as Director throughout that time?
Yes, I was, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then in January 2016, we can see that you founded OFR Consultants. Do you remain the Director of OFR Consultants?
That's actually changed since this report was written. So I dissolved all my shares, my ownership shares, back into the business. They've been redistributed to other senior people in the business. Just part of our legacy planning within the business, and I'm no longer a director. I don't sit on the board. I sit as an advisor to the board. I've been invited to be an advisor to the board, but I don't exercise any control over the business.
Right. And have you moved on to a different business or a different post?
No, I'm still at OFR. I'm just
Right.
an employee. The title I decided to hold was just fire engineer. That's,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then, can you help us? Do you have any formal qualifications in fire engineering?
No formal qualifications. No. Mm-hmm.
What about in smoke control? Do you have any formal qualifications in smoke control?
Not really, although I'm not really aware of any formal qualifications one might get in that area specifically. But my degree in aeronautical engineering is all about fluid dynamics, thermodynamics, and it is highly relevant to smoke control.
Yeah. If we look back at page 26 of your report and at paragraph 24 now, you say that the focus of your current role is the delivery of fire engineering advice to projects, including a number of tall residential building schemes. As part of my role, I produce, review and support others in the development of fire safety strategies. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
And then at paragraph 25, you go on and say, within my role, I carry out, commission and review complex smoke control analyses, support the development of smoke control system specifications, review subcontractor proposals for designs, carry out inspections during work on site and during the witnessing, commissioning and demonstrating of smoke control systems. Now, just very briefly, those smoke control analyses, are those written documents that you review?
It varies. So there's sometimes I carry out the analyses, and it might be simple hand calculations or spreadsheets. Sometimes these days I tend to have other people who do the more complex analyses. We have a big team that specialises on those sorts of things. Whereas in the past I used to actually do the hands-on analyses for myself. But it varies. So most of it is written documentation eventually, but it's computational modelling and analyses.
Yeah. Do you have any experience of actually designing such a system yourself, as opposed to reviewing or simply being involved in reviewing the process?
Very much so. Yeah, absolutely.
Then at page 460, just going back to that, you've set out selected project experience for high-rise residential buildings, which you've worked on in the last 5 years. Now, in terms of smoke control systems, can you confirm that you do have experience in the design, specifying, reviewing and commissioning of smoke control systems in high-rise residential buildings?
Yes, absolutely. High-rise buildings and what I call tall buildings as well. I think there's a slight distinction between those two. And many of those projects are legacy tall buildings as well.
Yes. And how much of that experience was in the context of refurbishment projects or legacy projects as opposed to new build?
I would say, a huge amount of my work has involved tall buildings. Probably around about sort of 50% of the work I've done in my career has been tall residential buildings. A smaller proportion of that is legacy buildings, simply because there's fewer of them that tend to get involved. It's been more recently, actually, interestingly enough, there's been more interest in legacy buildings, not just since Grenfell, but also just before Grenfell.
So give us an idea, in the last 5 years, how many legacy buildings might you have looked at?
So I've done some major estate reviews for developers who've had sort of 20 or 30 type buildings. I think one of them had over 60 projects that we looked at. And then I've been very involved in a number of projects that involve 3 or 4 tower clusters. So it's probably around about 100 legacy projects in the last sort of 6 or 7 years.
Yeah. Now, we're going to come on to the specifics of Grenfell Tower in due course in some detail, but just help us with this at this stage. In terms of your prior experience, have you ever come across a system which was designed and which operated in the same way as that installed at Grenfell Tower?
Do you mean the existing system, or do you mean the system that was put in at the refurbishment?
System that was put in.
At the refurbishment?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, I have, yes, yeah.
You have? You've come across systems that are the same as that which was installed at Grenfell Tower, have you?
Yes, yeah. The system type, where you have a single shaft and you get your make-up air coming through the door, is a common type.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And have you come across a system with exactly the same parameters as set for the system at Grenfell Tower?
What do you mean by the parameters?
So, for example, the 2 metres per second through the stair door criterion that was set by PSB. Have you come across a system that was set with that kind of criterion?
Well, generally you set the criteria to keep the stair relatively free of smoke, and then from that you derive what your parameters are going to be. But trying to achieve a adequate extract rate and an adequate flow rate through the door, because you need both of those things in these systems, yes, I've come across very similar, yeah.
Okay. Now, before we turn to the specifics of that system in more detail, I want to first cover with you the principles that apply to installing such a system in an existing building. In your report, you've provided an appendix, Appendix B, which sets out your view on how Part 2 of the building regulations applied in the context of the new system at Grenfell Tower. Now, if we go to that, it starts at page 465 in this report there. And if you look at section B at the foot of the page, and then over into page 3 of this annex, you take the view that the works to the smoke control system weren't a material change of use in respect of levels 4 to 23, because those levels remained residential dwellings, yes?
That's my interpretation and the way I've seen that sort of the regulations applied in the past, yes.
Yeah. And then you go on to consider whether the works to the system were a material alteration within the meaning of Regulation 3 of the Building Regulations 2010. And let's just have a look at that. This is at CLG 30199897 at page 6. So there we've got section 3. Mm-hmm. And if we look at subparagraph 2 at the bottom of that page, it tells us an alteration is material for the purposes of these regulations if the work or any part of it would at any stage result, A, in a building or controlled service or fitting not complying with a relevant requirement where previously it did, or B, in a building or controlled service or fitting which before the work commenced did not comply with a relevant requirement, being more unsatisfactory in relation to such a requirement. And if we go over the page, we can see that Regulation 2.3 below makes clear that where it refers to relevant requirements, it means the functional requirements of the building regulations. Is that correct?
That's what it says,
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. And then Regulation 4.3 is below this. And if we look at the bottom of page 7, little 3, it says here, building work shall be carried out so that after it has been completed, any building which is extended or to which a material alteration is made, or any building in or in connection with which a controlled service or fitting is provided, extended or materially altered, or any controlled service or fitting complies with the applicable requirements of Schedule 1, or where it did not comply with any such requirement is no more unsatisfactory in relation to that requirement than before the work was carried out. Now, so that is Regulation 4.3, and the requirements of Schedule 1 are set out at page 34 of this copy of the building regulations. There we have it, and we can see fire safety starts at the bottom, and we've got B1 there. The building shall be designed and constructed so that there are appropriate provisions for the early warning of fire and appropriate means of escape in case of fire from the building to a place of safety outside the building, capable of being safely and effectively used at all times. So that's the B1 requirement. And if we go over to page 35, we can see other requirements, including B3, internal fire spread, B4, external fire spread. I'm not going to read them all out in detail. And then B5.1 is at the bottom of that page, access and facilities for the fire service. The building shall be designed and constructed so as to provide reasonable facilities to assist firefighters in the protection of life. Now, would you agree, therefore, that in simple terms, if one's making changes to a building which have to comply with the regulations, the changes must either achieve compliance with the functional requirements of Schedule 1 or resulting in the building being no more unsatisfactory in relation to those functional requirements than it was before the changes?
I think how it's applied in practice is complex, but that is the principle, yes.
Yeah. And that no more unsatisfactory approach is often referred to as the non-worsening principle, isn't it?
Yes, the language that's used to reflect it does change, but it's the non-worsening and the no less satisfactory.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, if we just look at paragraph 23 of your report, page 470, there you're talking about the existing system, and you say this, so you're talking about the existing smoke control system, and you say if the existing system was non-functional, then this would arguably set the bar for testing the no more unsatisfactory condition very low. It is unlikely that any work would make a smoke control system more unsatisfactory than a non-functional system. Therefore, the system would not be a material alteration and hence not building work. Now, so you say that arguably you compare with a non-functioning system. Is that how you yourself interpret the regulations and how you apply them in your work?
Well, I mean, it's a statement from the regulations that it uses the term before the works are carried out as the benchmark for the no less satisfactory condition. So if you have a building that has a non-functional system, but somebody has determined that that system is not necessary from a life safety perspective, it might be a legacy condition that people no longer consider to be necessary, then it may well be that you no longer take it into account. So it can arise, and I've seen it arise in certain circumstances, but in this particular case, I don't think it was particularly relevant or pertinent. I also feel that there is other legislation that's supposed to stop buildings falling into a state where they're unsafe because the system is non-functional. So this situation shouldn't arise. If a system is needed for fire safety purposes, it should be kept functioning through the legislation such as the fire safety order that governs the operation of buildings. So there's an underlying background there to this as well, which I think I go on to say in my report.
I see. I just want to be absolutely clear about what your approach to the non-worsening principle is. Are you saying that in a position like we were in with Grenfell Tower, you could say, well, the existing system is non-functioning, so anything we do is better? Is that an approach that you think is correct?
It's not an approach that I would personally take, but it is an approach that somebody could take. Now, it's not an approach that I would personally want to see, because I prefer buildings to be safe, but it is a benchmark that could be used.
Oughtn't the benchmark to be, where you've got a non-functional system, how that system would perform if it was functioning and whether it was compliant with the functional requirements or not?
In my preference is that it ought to be like that, but that's not specifically what the regulations say. But like I say, there's also other legislation which means that system should not be in a dilapidated state. So it shouldn't really arise in practice. And I think it's wrong to look at the two completely separately. I think there is an interrelationship between the different pieces of legislation. but it is theoretically possible.
I see. So can we leave it at this? You're saying it's theoretically possible, but not an approach that you would ever take?
Not that I would personally endorse, no. Not unless I could be absolutely sure that the system wasn't necessary for life safety purposes. And I say I have seen situations, not with smoke control systems, but with other fire safety provisions, where they've become redundant, but nobody considers it to be problematic, and therefore it could be left as it is.
Right. And do you consider that such an approach, the approach you've put in here, is open to a reasonably competent engineer to take?
Well, it's not really for the engineer necessarily to decide. It's for the approver to decide if they really want to accept that particular perspective. I wouldn't expect someone acting in a professional, competent manner to advocate that unless they were absolutely sure that the system did not or was not required for life safety purposes.
Right. Now, if we go to page 471 of your report and paragraph 27, you tell us there that notwithstanding the complexities as to how the material alteration test applied to Grenfell, the system works were ultimately treated as building work for the purposes of the building regulations, yes? That's what we saw in practice.
Yes. Can we just go back slightly on this, though? So the combination of regulations 3 and 4 tell you what is building work and how building work is treated under regulations. It's very easy to slip up here because you have work. So work is anything that happens in a building, and you have the very specific term building work,
yes,
which lots of other requirements apply to. The test of whether something is building work, as I think we've just looked at, in this context anyway, is whether it results in a material alteration. And judging whether something is a material alteration is quite a complex matter, because you might have to work out whether the no less satisfactory condition has been reached. Now, if you think about it, on a complex project, you're quite a long way down the line of spending time and effort working out if something is material or not. So you can kind of take two approaches, I think. You could either say, we can either work out before we consider what is building work or not, whether it's no less satisfactory, which is, I think, the sort of to the letter of the regulations. You work out if something is no less satisfactory, and that determines whether it's building work or not. Alternatively, and particularly on a more complex project, you could say, well, everything's building work, but when I come to judge those items which were existing, I may apply a certain amount of latitude to that and apply a no less satisfactory test, because that's then putting it into the context of all the other works. So it's the regulations themselves are really quite simple. I used to hate the regulations. I used to think they were terribly worded and they were cumbersome. But actually, I've come to, over time, particularly doing expert witness work, to realise that they're actually a very clever piece of regulation that's designed to cover a huge range of building projects and lots of variation within those projects, whether you've got all new build, whether you've got some existing restrictions and constraints. And it's very difficult to apply a very rigid set of rules to that. So there is a certain amount of flexibility, and this is one of those areas that allows the approver to apply their judgment to work out the best way of approaching it.
Okay.
And I think that happened here. Sorry, just to go back to the paragraph you noted, that they treated it all as building work because it's far more pragmatic to treat everything as building work and then perhaps apply a different judgment to certain aspects of the work than it is to try and say, right, we're going to treat this bit as building work and this bit as work,
yes,
and split it up like that. It's not a very pragmatic approach.
Yeah. Now, can we agree that the relevant functional requirements when we're thinking about the smoke control system would have been B1, means of warning and escape, B5, access and facilities for the fire service, yes?
Yes.
But also B3, internal fire spread in terms of the system's vertical smoke shafts?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Now, if we look at page 473 of your report now, at section D, you've got a section where you consider Schedule 1, that's the setting out the functional requirements, and also regulations 8 and 11 of the building regulations, which I don't think we've looked at much at all yet in this inquiry. And if we go to paragraph 40 there, you say, when considering what the functional requirements in Schedule 1 may require, a BCB, so that's a building control body, is also bound to apply the reasonableness test created by Regulation 8. Do you see that there?
I do see that, yep.
And you also highlight in the next paragraph, that a building control body, you say further, a building control body will be aware that it has the power to relax or dispense with regulations if it wants by virtue of Regulation 11, yes?
That's correct, yeah.
And then looking at the next page, page 43, you also say that the regulations don't require the building control body to document whether the approach it has taken has been specifically informed by the provisions of Regulation 8 or 11, yes?
That's correct, yeah.
And you say that in practice, this is the last sentence, a relaxation may also simply be made by the building control body, deciding or agreeing to adopt a lesser standard of provision when approving works under the regulations. Do you see that?
I do. It's one of those interesting things from coming out of the inquiry and looking back over some of the older legislation, particularly through one of Luke Bisbee's recent reports. If you look back at the regulations from the 1970s, they used to have a little form that was set out in the regulations that said if you were going to dispense or relax from regulation, you had to fill that paperwork in. Now, Professor Bisbee makes the point that as more changes were coming up and people were worried about building control officers being sort of overburdened with workload, it seems that form was lost when we got to the regulations in the 80s and then onto these regulations as well. So the process of documenting that used to be set out in the regulations was taken away.
Right. So in effect, is this right? You say that it's up to building control to decide if it would not be reasonable to meet the requirements of Schedule 1 with no requirement to expressly document this. Is that effectively what you're saying in those paragraphs?
Ultimately, I think that's the power that's created for building control officers under Regulation 11, yes.
Let's look at Regulation 8, which was the first one you referred to in that section. This is at CLD 3019897 at page 9. It's the very bottom of the page. This is Regulation 8. It's called Limitation on Requirements. And it says this: Parts A to D, so that would include Part B on fire safety, F to K and P, except for a number of paragraphs, of Schedule 1 shall not require anything to be done except for the purpose of securing reasonable standards of health and safety for persons in or about buildings and any others who may be affected by buildings or matters connected with buildings. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And if we could look at what you say about this in another section of your report, if we go to page 60, paragraph 1572, perhaps we could have that on the right-hand page, leaving this on the left-hand page, if that's possible. Sorry, no, it was page 60 of his report. Don't worry, if it's difficult to split the pages, let's just have page 60 of your report up. LAY 701, page 60. There we have it. Thank you. So at 157.2 of your report, you say this: Regulation 8 introduces the word reasonable into the limitation on requirements section. What is reasonable is a matter of interpretation. Unreasonable requirements will not just include impossible requirements, but could also include requirements which are unduly prohibitive with regards to the viability or functionality of a building. In my experience, this has had an important effect on the operation of the regulatory regime by introducing a reasonableness test into the process of considering what the functional requirements in Schedule 1 require in the circumstances of any given project. Do you see that?
I do see that. Can I just also make the point that there is also paragraph 157.1, which makes it clear that Regulation 8 relates to health and safety of persons in or about buildings.
Yes, I've just read that in Regulation 8.
You didn't. Sorry, you went straight to paragraph 157.2.
Yes.
Yes, there's been a suggestion made that I didn't make a statement as at 157.1. I just wanted to be clear that I did.
No, I'm not suggesting.
Sorry, it's been suggested elsewhere.
It's going to be better if you don't anticipate my question.
Okay.
That's okay. Looking at the language of Regulation 8 itself that we've got on the left-hand side, can we agree that it's saying that specified parts of Schedule 1 don't require anything to be done except when it comes to securing reasonable standards of health and safety? Do you see that?
I do, yeah. And I think also you have to be aware of the language of the functional requirements, which also have the words adequate and reasonable within
Yes.
the times as well. Yeah.
Yes, they do, and I'm coming to that.
Okay.
Now, but just on this Regulation 8 point and what the thrust of Regulation 8 is about, there's some discussion of this in the approved document B, which I just wanted to take you to. This is at CLG 50224 at page 7. If we go to page 7 within this. Perhaps we could have that as the full page, because this is quite small text. So there's a section here called Limitation on Requirements in Approved Document B. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
In the left-hand column. And we can see in the first paragraph of that section, it effectively repeats the text of Regulation 8, which we've already read. And at the end sentence, it says, this is one of the categories of purpose for which building regulations may be made. And then it says paragraphs H2 and J7 are excluded from Regulation 8 because they deal directly with prevention of the contamination of water. Parts E and M, which deal respectively with resistance to the passage of sound and access to and use of buildings, are excluded from Regulation 8 because they address the welfare and convenience of building users. Part L is excluded from Regulation 8 because it addresses the conservation of fuel and power. All these matters are amongst the purposes other than health and safety that may be addressed by the building regulations. Do you see that?
I do, yes.
So isn't it the case that the real thrust of Regulation 8, what it's really getting at, is simply to tell you that certain parts of the functional requirements don't require anything to be done, save for the purposes of securing reasonable standards of health and safety?
Well, that's one part of it, yes. But there is also, it has the word reasonable in there for a reason, I presume. And I've seen it applied in practice, and that's how I've seen it interpreted. But quite why it has the word reasonable in there is, I guess, a matter of law. It's written into the regulations.
Yes. And are you saying that in practice there's a separate stage, a separate test of reasonableness that's applied to the functional requirements themselves? Is that what you're saying?
I think there can be, yes.
But aren't those functional requirements themselves already addressed in a way which incorporates such reasonableness requirements? We saw it before, and you've just made the point. B1, appropriate provision for means of escape. B4, adequately resisting the spread of fire. B5, reasonable facilities for the fire service in B5. I just want to be really clear what you're saying. Are you saying that there's some additional test or gloss that applies over and above those functional requirements, which you say applies an additional reasonableness test?
I don't know if I say it's a specific additional gloss over the top, but it's the wording that's in there. It's a wording I've seen applied in practice. And you have to take the fact that some of the functional requirements, not all of them say reasonable. I mean, B5 says reasonable provisions for firefighters. B1 doesn't say reasonable, it says adequate, and it says at all material times. So there's lots of complex wording in there. So perhaps this is there just to remind people that it is only reasonable. I didn't write the regulations. I can only talk about how it's applied, how I see it applied. So.
No, I entirely appreciate that. I just want to understand what your interpretation is, and we'll come to how you say it applies at Grenfell in a moment. Are you saying, for example, that there's a test of using reasonable endeavours to comply with the functional requirements? Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think so, yeah. Mm-hmm. And if it's unreasonable, if complying with the requirements is unreasonable, then the person reviewing the work, the building control body, could then decide to either relax, or they could just decide that they're happy with it, that it's adequate, yeah.
Right. If we look at Regulation 11 now of the building regulations, that's at CLG 3019897, page 10.
Mm-hmm.
Here we can see it's towards the bottom of the page, above the part 3, and it's headed power to dispense with or relax requirements. And it says, subject to paragraph 3, the power under section 8(1) of the Act, that's under the Building Act 1984, to dispense with or relax any requirement contained in these regulations shall be exercisable by the local authority. So it's telling us that it's the local authority that can relax or dispense with regulations.
Yeah, because the Act provides for the Secretary of State to do it, and then this is passing it on to the building control.
Yes.
Local authority, building control. Yeah.
Now, Dr. Lane has told us in her report, for the transcript, that's at paragraph 2.5.3 of her supplementary report, BLARP 25043 at page 29, she said that in her experience, it's extremely rare for a dispensational relaxation of a functional requirement, certainly B1 to B5, to be sought or granted. Is that your experience as well?
No, it's not. And it's often not done quite so explicitly as that, I would say. I mean, I just discussed with you just now about the possibility of treating building works in a way where you treat them as no less satisfactory. Well, the actual strict wording of the regulations is things are either building works or they're not. But you might treat something as building works. You then might apply a reasonableness test because it's an existing building. And that's using the powers of Regulation 11, technically. I don't think building control officers necessarily think of it in that way. They don't necessarily dissect it in that way. But there is certainly a climate, you might argue, of reasonableness and the such like, which is created by the combination of these regulations.
Right. If a building control body did decide that applying, for example, the B1 functional requirement, that was unreasonable in a particular case, wouldn't one expect to see that very clearly documented and communicated on a particular project, given the importance of the functional requirements to life safety?
So as I said just now, in prior versions of the legislation, that did happen. But these days it comes down to the professionalism of the people applying it. And it depends on the context as well. I mean, you have to remember the regulations cover everything from the extension on the back of your house up to a massive multi-user high-rise super tall building. So it has to be looked at in the context. So I would expect them to document it in the case of a more complex project, but I can understand why in a simpler case it might not get documented.
Just tell me this, if you would.
Sure.
If the building control officer passes something which you might consider was not fully compliant, do you assume that he or she has applied his mind to it and decided to pass it, or can you think he might have made a mistake? How do you know?
I totally agree. That is a significant problem with the way the regulations work. I've come across situations where I've seen building control officers or other approvers approve things that I don't think do meet the regulations, but they have passed them. Now, whether they've passed them because they consider it does meet the regulations, whether they pass them because they've not understood something, or whether they've passed them deliberately falsely, I don't know. But it does happen, I think. And it's a really complicated thing to unpick, because the only real test you have of building regulations compliance in practice is whether people have given completion certificates and approved works. But then one
might have thought, though, perhaps, sorry to interrupt you, but one might have thought that if you're going to exercise a dispensing power, one ought to not only apply one's mind to the question, but to make it clear that you have applied your mind and granted a dispensation. Is that not?
I agree. It would be better if these things were properly documented. And there's certain guidance out there. So when you do things like hospitals, you do specifically document where you vary from the guidance for hospitals. But that isn't carried across into every building. Right. But like I say, it could be because the regulations apply across this, well, some would say absurdly, but very wide group of buildings.
Right, thank you.
And just to be clear what you're saying about the relevance of this to Grenfell Tower, are you saying that RBKC Building Control did take this dispensational relaxation route in relation to the smoke control system at Grenfell Tower? Is that what you're saying?
It's difficult to say exactly how they determined it, but certainly through a combination of various factors, whether it was treating existing works as building works and then applying a different test, or whether it was through a different pathway of these regulations. I think they did consider the building within the context of its existing nature, and therefore applied a test of reasonableness to the works that could be carried out there.
Yes, but I'm talking about Regulation 11 now, the power to dispense with or relax requirements. Are you saying that at Grenfell Tower, you think that RBKC Building Control did decide to relax or dispense with some of the requirements of the functional requirements?
Well, as I said just now, I don't think in practice it's often set out in that way, that they particularly pick through the regulations and say, right, I'm going to apply Regulation 11. I think what Regulation 11 and Regulation 8 create is a climate within which building control feel that they can exercise their own considerations. So I wouldn't necessarily believe that they particularly chose that particular route and documented it, because that's not necessarily the way that building control work in practice, in my experience.
Are you saying that, in effect, the building control body has a complete discretion to decide what they think is reasonable in the circumstances?
I think ultimately they do have that discretion, yes.
Right. If we go to paragraph 169.5 of your report on page 63, so it's 169.5 I want to look at, and this is where you've been discussing Regulation 11 and 8 before it, and you say here, by these means, latitude is provided to the building control body within the structure of the building regulations, which enables the building control body to take into account particular building constraints, yes?
Yes.
Is that another way of putting the point I just put to you, that effectively you're saying building control has a complete discretion to decide what they think is reasonable in the circumstances?
I think it's probably a better way of putting the explanation I gave a few minutes ago about the fact that it creates a climate of latitude.
Right.
Yeah.
And you don't think that that effectively renders parts of the building regulations otiose if you read them like that?
Sorry, what's that word mean? Sorry, I'm not familiar.
Irrelevant. Wouldn't that render the non-worsening provision?
I wouldn't say irrelevant, sorry. I think irrelevant would be taking that far too far. They have to they take these things into account, but they decide what is reasonable. So the test under the regulations is about whether or not you achieve adequate safety. But what is adequate or not can change. It changes with time, it changes between buildings. So I think that's the way it's used, is to work out what they consider is adequate and reasonable.
Right. Now, we saw earlier that you said there was no obligation on the building control body to document how compliance with the building regulations had been achieved, yes?
As far as I'm aware, that's what the regulations say, yeah.
Yes, but can we agree that Regulation 14 of the building regulations, which deals with full plans applications, let's just look at that, CLG 30199897 at page 13. Regulation 14, if we look at subparagraph 2, it makes it clear that full plans shall be deposited in duplicate, of which the local authority may retain one copy, and where Part B of Schedule 1, Fire Safety, imposes a requirement in relation to proposed building works, an additional 2 copies of any such plans, as demonstrate compliance with that requirement, shall be deposited, both of which may be retained by the local authority. And you can see that below that, subparagraph 3, little c, it tells you that full plans shall consist of, and it has to consist of various things, including at C, any other plans which are necessary to show that the work would comply with these regulations. Now, I appreciate you may be drawing a distinction between what building control has to document and what the person making the full plans application has to demonstrate. But can we agree that when it comes to the full plans application, the person carrying out the work does have a duty to document how it's going to comply with the building regulations?
So they have people who have responsibilities under the building regulations have a duty to document how they are going to achieve compliance. Exactly what level that they have to document that to is another question. It's a separate question, because you might just document compliance. We're talking about the smoke control system, but I don't want to jump your questions here, but you wouldn't necessarily provide in a full plans application every nut and bolt detail. You might set out the principles that are going to be applied, and then when it comes to the completion certificate and the review of the works on site, further information is covered. And again, this is part of the regulations covering a very wide set of buildings. if you build a kitchen extension, you'd expect to put on the plans all the things you need to do to comply with the regulations, and it's fairly simple. When it comes to a massive, complex project, there's a special provision. So the duty for the building control officer under the regulations actually, of course, comes from the Building Act, Section 16, and they are required to either accept, reject, or offer a conditional approval. And what tends to happen in practice on complex buildings, because the level of detail you would need to go into to show that every aspect of the regulations is definitively complied with, you tend to get what's called conditional approval, at which point the fine details
Sorry,
get
Mr. Lane, I'm going to
passed on.
stop you there. Grenfell Tower wasn't a case where we had a conditional approval, was it? There's no evidence that any conditional approval was issued by building control.
To some extent there was.
Well, what we know from the facts is that, in fact, there was no response at all by building control to the full plans application that was made. So this is not a situation where there was a conditional approval. Take that from me.
With respect to the smoke control system, there was an approval of the technical submission at submission S1A, subject to it meeting or being expected to meet the guidance in the Smoke Control Association. So that's a form of conditional approval. It may not have been written down as that, but again, exactly how you document approval comes down to the individual protocols of each building control office.
I understand that there may be a range of behaviour, reasonable behaviour, in terms of what you have to show, what you have to document. But can we agree that this full plans provision does require, looking at little c again, any other plans which are necessary to show that the work would comply with these regulations? You can't just have nothing, can you?
You can't have nothing. Well, I wouldn't expect somebody to accept nothing. But as I say, there is latitude within that, thanks to things like conditional approval and everything else.
Yes. If we could go to your report, page 14, paragraph 8, you say in the first lines of paragraph 8, first, the reports of Dr. Lane are critical of the absence of detailed analysis and documentation in relation to the system, including the commissioning process. Dr. Lane's criticism is to some extent valid, and my own preference is that designs and works are properly documented at the time. However, neither the Building Act nor the Building Regulations 2010 impose a separate duty on relevant persons to document how they achieve compliance. Now, I would suggest to you that that's simply not right in relation to what we've just read in Regulation 14, where the full plans application has to contain enough information to show that the functional requirements have been met.
I would say what I mean by that is it doesn't specify exactly how much detail is required and how much the level of detail that's required to demonstrate compliance. You have to demonstrate compliance, but depending on what the building control officer wants will vary what level of information is required to demonstrate that compliance.
Yes, but that's not the point you make here, is it? You're not saying the building regulations don't tell you in what detail you have to document compliance. You say here that they don't impose a separate duty on relevant persons to document how they achieve compliance.
I think that's what I mean, is what I've just said, and I mean it with the word how they achieve compliance. So they need to show the works would achieve compliance. Exactly how they achieve compliance is the level of detail.
I see.
I apologise if that's not clear, but that's what I mean by it.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. I want to ask you some questions now about the Local Government Association guide on fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats. Now, that guidance is dated, we'll look at it in a moment, it's dated June 2011. But can we agree that the primary purpose of that LGA guide was to provide guidance to housing providers and enforcing authorities on compliance with the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 and the Housing Act 2004, rather than addressing the building regulations and the functional requirements in the building regulations?
So that's the purpose for which it was created, but I wouldn't exclude it from having relevance elsewhere.
Okay. Can we look at ADB again? If we go to CLG 50224, and I want to look at page 13. There's a section there headed Alternative Approaches in the right-hand column. And I just want to read the 3 paragraphs underneath that. So it says at 0.21, the fire safety requirements of the building regulations should be satisfied by following the relevant guidance given in this approved document. However, approved documents are intended to provide guidance for some of the more common building situations, and there may well be alternative ways of achieving compliance with the requirements. If other codes or guidance are adopted, the relevant recommendations concerning fire safety in the particular publication should be followed rather than a mixture of the publication and provisions in the relevant sections of this approved document. However, there may be circumstances where it's necessary to use one publication to supplement another. And then it goes on. Guidance documents intended specifically for assessing fire safety in existing buildings will often include provisions which are less onerous than those set out on this approved document or other standards applicable to new buildings. As such, these documents are unlikely to be appropriate for use where building work controlled by the regulations is proposed. Do you see that? So looking at the final paragraph, do you agree, or can we agree that approved document B is quite clear that guidance documents intended for fire safety in existing buildings are not likely to be appropriate when we're looking at building work controlled by the building regulations themselves?
I think there's 2 points to make there. First of all, everything in the approved document B is couched within the caveats at the start of the approved document B, which say that you do not have to apply the approved document B. You can apply anything else that you consider to be appropriate. And secondly, as I just explained, there's in practice 2 ways that existing buildings or works or existing works are treated under the regulations. The strict way, as I understand it, of following regulations 3 and 4 is you determine whether something is building work or not by the no less satisfactory condition. So if it wasn't any less satisfactory, sorry, that's why the language keeps getting changed on that particular point. It can be quite confusing. If it's no less satisfactory, it wouldn't be building work, in which case you would argue that that paragraph doesn't apply. However, if you were to apply it as building work and then you apply a reasonableness test to decide whether it's no less satisfactory, you might argue that paragraph applies. But that's, I think, because the approved document B is reflecting the strict version of interpreting the regulations, saying that you shouldn't even consider it building work if it's already no less satisfactory.
I think what I'm putting to you is the specific point that's made in that 3rd paragraph, which is that guidance documents, other guidance documents, like the LGA guide, which are intended specifically for assessing fire safety in existing buildings, it's warning that that will often include a provision that's less onerous than what we see in the approved documents, and they're unlikely to be appropriate when work is controlled by the building regulations. That's the point I'm putting to you.
Yes, I think that's what it says, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But, okay.
Yeah. But I've explained it. I think it needs to be looked at in context.
Yes. And paragraph 2 is also warning about mixing guidance, isn't it? It's saying that really, if you're looking at fire safety, you perhaps ought to follow a particular guidance publication in full rather than mixing different sections of different documents.
It's warning about that, yeah. The term that's often used for that is cherry picking, where people take the least onerous provision from one place and the least onerous from somewhere else. There are absolutely cases where you need to mix guidance, or guidance might help inform you to make a decision, particularly in more complex scenarios. So it does say that, but there may be circumstances where it's necessary to use one publication to supplement another.
Right. Now let's go to the LGA guide itself, CLG 50453. If we could just look at the first page just to start with, just to orientate ourselves. There it is, fire safety in purpose-built blocks of flats. It'll be well familiar to a number of people watching. We've looked at it a number of times. If we could go to page 3, the forward starts at page 2, and this is the end of the forward, so in page 3. And I want to look at the beginning of the 2nd paragraph. There, it says, this guide is intended to meet the needs of housing providers and enforcing authorities for guidance tailored to purpose-built blocks of flats, yes?
Yes.
So that's its purpose. It doesn't say for example, does it, that it's there to assist specialist designers of smoke control systems?
Well, it doesn't say that, but I'm not sure. Okay, go on. Yeah, it doesn't say that, yeah.
And can we agree that there's one section specific to smoke control in this document? It's at page 85. It starts at page 85 in this 192-page guide. And it contains guidance of the most general nature, this specific bit on smoke control. It's very general guidance here and over the page on smoke control. There's nothing specific and detailed about it, is there, in here?
It's not detailed and specific, but it does make some very important points about the shift in smoke control philosophy, for example.
Yes, I'll come to that in a moment.
Well, it was on the page you just had up previously, sorry, that's why I
Yeah.
mentioned it.
Now, if
Smoke control is mentioned obviously in more detail. You're going to go into that, I presume. Some
Yes,
more
I
detailed
am.
points, yeah.
If we look back at your report for a moment, at page 167, and I want to look at the very bottom of 167 at paragraph 539, you say, this is where you're talking about the existing system. You say the system focused on protecting the stair by extraction and creating a flow of air through the open stair door, which would limit the potential for smoke to reach the stair. Sorry, that's the new system. That was the intention of the new system, which was focused on protecting the stair by extraction and creating a flow of air through the open stair door, which would limit the potential for smoke to reach the stair. And you go on, you say this would offer a degree of protection to the common lobby by extracting smoke from that space and cooling, diluting smoke that was in the common lobby. And then if we look at paragraphs 540, you say this was different to the existing system, which had intended to create a flow of air through the common lobby without a specific consideration of whether the stair would be protected. That is to say, the existing system sought to protect the lobby and, by consequence, to provide a degree of protection to the stair, whilst the new system, sought to protect the stair and, by consequence, to provide a degree of protection to the lobby. Yes?
Yes.
And if we look at paragraph 542 below that, you say opposing airflow through the stair door needed to protect the stair is only created when the stair door is opened. Until the door is opened, the flow of air through the lobby will be low and the smoke clearance available will be limited. As a result of this, relying on airflow via the stair is not appropriate where there is a need to focus on protecting the lobby, such as where the travel distances in a building are excessive. Yes?
Yes.
So you're saying there that if you've got excessive travel distances in your lobby, then focusing primarily on protection of the stair may not be appropriate because you may need to protect the lobby with those extended travel distances, yes?
Yes, you would need to both protect the stair and the lobby.
Because there could be a build-up of smoke in the lobby before the residents make it to the stair.
Correct, yes. In fact, there almost certainly will be a build-up of smoke in the lobby. That's the way that most of the other guidance puts it.
Now, I want to focus on what's an excessive travel distance in this context. If we look at paragraph 548 on page 170, you note that picking it up in the second line, second sentence, under current guidance where sprinklers are not provided, the maximum travel distance occupants are expected to walk in an unventilated portion of escape route is 7.5 metres, as shown, for example, in ADB, figure 2.7 left, and BS 9991, figure 2.7 right. And you've then helpfully set out those diagrams below that. If we could just blow those up, so it's not terribly clear. What I'm going to do is let's look at ADB itself. CLG 50224 at page 28, we see diagram 7. There it is, and it's much clearer there.
Yeah, it's better.
And we can see, focusing on lobby access dwellings in the bottom diagram, that we've got a 7.5 metre maximum travel distance set by ADB. Is that right?
I've focused on the single stair condition here, just because I think it was clearer in my report to use this, but it recommends a maximum 7.5 metres, yes. Would say it's a requirement. Could we not use the word requirement, please? Because it's not a requirement, it's a recommendation.
I fully appreciate that. I'm well aware of what the status of the approved document is, and I apologise if I said requirement. But if you're following this guidance, it's telling you that the maximum travel distance is 7.5 metres, yes?
Yes.
And that's the approved document.
Yes.
And we see something similar in BS 9991, don't we? We don't need to go to that.
We don't, that's right, yeah.
In your report. So those two pieces of guidance are saying 7.5 metres.
Mm-hmm. You can also see here that the protection is to the space that is attached to the staircase. So you have 7.5 metres in an unventilated space, so there's no provision of any ventilation to that space at all. And in diagram 7B, you have protection with a ventilated space.
Yes. And just in summary, your view is that these excessive travel distances that were experienced at Grenfell Tower were acceptable based on the LGA guide, which indicates that travel distances up to 10 metres would not be considered excessive. That's in summary your view, yes?
Sorry, just say that question again.
In your report, you say that the travel distances experienced at Grenfell Tower, which were more than 7.5 metres, were acceptable based on the LGA guide, which indicates that travel distances up to 10 metres would not be considered excessive.
I think that's one way of looking at them. In my report, I've tried to provide a number of different ways of looking at the travel distances at Grenfell Tower in the existing levels. One way of looking at it could be to use the LGA guide, but there's other ways of looking at it as well. I'm just trying to provide clarity on how someone might reach a conclusion that they were not excessive.
Yes. Let's look at those travel distance measurements. If we could go to Dr. Lane's report, BLARP 2 5043 at page 271. This is in her supplemental report. If we go to page 271. And if we could blow up these diagrams, what we can see here is Dr. Lane's measured travel distance is on the left-hand side. And we can see that she is saying from the flat 4, she has measured, with those lines there, 10.3 metres. Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
Yeah. That's her calculation in her report. Then we've got your travel distance. And you've measured with more direct lines, more direct diagonal lines than she has. And we can see that you come to 9.5 metres. Is that correct?
I do make it 9.5 metres.
Yeah. And she notes on the right that when Exova did their existing fire safety strategy report, on the right-hand side of this page, Exova said in their existing fire safety strategy that the furthest distance from flat 4 was 9.3 metres, yes?
I think that's the BRE, not Exova, who said that. They measured it on site at 9.3.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Sorry, you're absolutely right. That's the BRE measurement in their forensic fire report. You're right, sorry. So we've got 9.3, 9.5 and 10.5. Can we agree that there isn't any piece of guidance which gives any detailed description of how you measure travel distance?
Well, there's detailed guidance for some circumstances, certain things you have to take count of, like obstructions and the such like, but when you're walking across a space, it's the direct distance, it's the actual distance someone would walk.
Yes.
Which is why I've included, so there's the little yellow circles provide space for someone to walk past a corner, for example. So you couldn't take it cut right across the corner because someone couldn't walk that close to a wall.
Yes.
So that's the actual distance that someone would have to walk, and that's I think BS 9991 uses that.
Yeah, so in BS 9991, the closest we get to something, it says it's got to be the actual distance to be travelled by a person along an escape route.
Yes.
For the transcript, that's BSI 50621 at page 21.
Yeah. And within all the guidance documents, there's plenty of cases of people walking in diagonal lines and taking angles of more or less than 45 degrees. They all have examples of that within them.
Yes. Now let's go to the LGA guide again, because this is one of the pieces of guidance you rely on, yes, in relation to travel distance.
Well, I reference it, but as I say, I don't think it's the only piece of guidance. I'm trying to use it to explain how a competent person, as I believe Mr. Hanson has said in the inquiry that he didn't consider it to be an unreasonable travel distance, and Miss Menzies said the same thing. So I'm trying to provide the inquiry with my interpretation of how they might have reached such a conclusion.
Yes, I understand you say that, and we have the evidence of Mr. Hanson and Miss Menzies. That's understood. But I'm seeking to put to you, can I put this before we go to the LGA guide? Is there any other piece of guidance you can point to that suggests that something over 7.5 metres is not excessive?
Well, I think you have to be very careful to treat 7.5 metres as a hard and fast maximum. The approved document itself says you can have extended distances in some cases. And I wouldn't even treat 10 metres as a hard and fast requirement. I think it's wrong to think of these things that at 10.1 metres it becomes unacceptable, and at 9.8 metres or 10 metres it is acceptable. It's all about the context of the space. I mean, this was quite a simple space. You had a short dead-end region, but then you had a large open lobby space. It's a space people are familiar with, and all of these things feed into whether something is excessive or not. If it had been a much more complex labyrinthine type arrangement, you might take a different view. So I think it's wrong to these. I always think of numbers like 7.5 metres. I mean, it has no specific scientific basis to it. It's just a number that's been shown to be acceptable over the years and has come about. So I would look at that as something to say, well, should we think about this? If it's more than 7.5 metres, well, have we got any ventilation? Because the ADB says 7.5 metres is okay without ventilation, so maybe we need some ventilation. And that's actually quite reflective of what the LGA guide says. So there's a commonality of thought across the industry on that point. So I wouldn't treat them as hard and fast.
Let's go back to the LGA guide, CST 30s14237, and look at page 87. CST 30s14237, page 87. Now, we can see that it indicates what the current benchmark design guidance is. It's under the heading benchmark guidance at 58.23. And it says the following reflects the current benchmark design guidance for both single and multiple stairway blocks of flats with corridor or lobby access. And we can see that it says at the second bullet point, the distance of travel between the flat entrance door and the door to a lobby or stairway should be limited to 7.5 metres. And if you look at the following page, figure 8, they've essentially got the same diagram as in approved document B, yes?
Yes.
It appears in here. And then if you go to page 94 of this guide, and if we look at 62.1, it says this: although the above benchmarks reflect current design guidance, many existing blocks of flats designed to earlier standards or in which alterations have taken place will not comply with these benchmarks. For example, existing blocks of flats may have increased travel distances, and there may be no corridor or lobby protection to the stairways. Smoke control arrangements may be non-existent or differ from what is acceptable today. And this section of the LGI then goes on below at 62.2 to say that it says, in these circumstances, upgrading to current standards, although ideal, may not be possible due to the physical constraints in the building or justifiable on the basis of risk. Therefore, there will need be a need to consider the overall risk. Now, does this suggest that even if you are using this guidance, and even if you accept that it could be relevant to building work under the building regulations, that there ought to at least be some assessment of the overall risk which is presented by increased travel distances?
I think there should be some assessment, but the extent of that assessment will depend upon the distances involved and, as I said, the complexity of the space and the such like. I think it's also worth remembering that all of this exists under guidance for means of escape, but it's not entirely clear that those distances relate only to means of escape.
Now, the LGA guide then refers to potential compensatory measures in 62.3. It says, in some blocks, restoring the block back to the standard of the day might be all that's needed. In others, compensatory measures might be needed to be considered. In exceptional circumstances, automatic fire detection and alarm systems and automatic fire suppression systems might also need to be considered, yes?
Yes.
Now, there was no such compensatory measures put in place at Grenfell Tower in respect of the travel distances, was there?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
No. And then at 62.4, it says the acceptance of standards in existing blocks of flats where they significantly differ from current benchmarks should be subject to careful scrutiny. This may require assessment. Sorry, it's just gone off my page. This may require assessment by a suitable specialist. However, the following general guidance may assist when considering the available options for means of escape. Now, again, doesn't this suggest that if you are effectively deciding not to follow current benchmarks, then this should be assessed by a suitable specialist, yes?
If they significantly differ, there may be circumstances where you need to use a suitable specialist, but that will come down to the individual circumstances.
And who would be a suitable specialist in the context of a smoke control system?
Well, I would expect it to be a fire engineer.
Right. And then if we look at 62.6 over the page, and you rely in particular on this section in your report, it basically says that accepting travel distances may be considered accepting increased travel distances may be considered appropriate in individual circumstances and will be particularly relevant in older types of property where there's little scope for alternatives.
Sorry, which bit was that? I've lost track of where you were on the page.
Sorry.
That's a summary of 62.6.
The travel distances specified earlier have been found to achieve the requisite level of safety, but were never intended to be hard and fast, and different limits have applied in the past.
Yes.
And it talks in the last sentence, this will be particularly relevant in older types of property where there will be little scope to reduce the existing travel distances or provide alternative means of escape.
Yes.
And then looking at the table below 62.7, this provides some benchmarks for existing blocks of flats. And we can see in the third bullet point, it says in ventilated lobbies and corridors, increases from 7.5 metres up to 10 metres may be acceptable. Are likely to be acceptable in most situations with no additional measures. Do you see that?
I do see that, yes.
So in this respect, the LGA guide is different to both Approved Document B and BS 9991 2011 in its definition of extended travel distances, isn't it?
Yes, it is. But I think, again, it's worth thinking about a little bit of context to what those distances mean. So why might a 10-metre travel distance be acceptable? So I mentioned just now that this is all about means of escape, and that's the section it appears under. But we have to be careful and be aware of the fact that in residential buildings, the firefighting provisions refer back to the means of escape provisions as well. So we have some weird situations occurring in residential buildings, like 2 staircase buildings that have massively extended travel distances with no ventilation to the corridor. I think the current guidance allows you to have up to 30 metres effectively in an unventilated corridor. Now, whether you've got 2 staircases, for the person who's escaping from a flat, it doesn't matter how many staircases you've got, they're still in a corridor full of smoke. But those distances actually relate more to firefighting. So in a firefighting condition, when you've got, in this instance, perhaps different ventilation conditions, you might accept longer distances as well. So it's slightly more subtle than that, I think, and you need to be alive to the fact that these impact on lots of measures within the building.
Okay. But isn't it important to recognise that this guidance is focused on compliance with the RRO 2005? So although this is suggesting that when you're doing a fire risk assessment, one can generally leave distances between 7.5 and 10 metres unmitigated in a ventilated lobby, isn't that different to the position where one is carrying out new building work, which is caught by the building regulations?
So the test under the fire safety order is that you achieve an adequate level of safety. So I would say in an existing building, if you're carrying out work, part of your test about whether you're no less satisfactory will be whether you're tested against the level of adequate safety that's achieved under the fire safety order. So I think it would carry across. And this might be written or might have come about to assist people with carrying out fire risk assessments and other matters. It does say to support approval authorities in existing buildings. Then it goes on to talk about the fire safety order in the opening paragraphs. I wouldn't exclude it as being something that someone might take into consideration, or that it might represent a collective industry view on what might typically be the sort of distance you could extend to without worrying about it.
Right. Mr. Chairman, just one more question before we break.
Yes, very well.
In this instance, it's not just a like-for-like replacement of the smoke control system, but a newly designed system being put in. So wouldn't you expect to see, at the very least, a detailed analysis carried out if the view was that the travel distances would remain in excess of 7.5 metres?
I would expect to see that if they were significantly excessive, if they were excessive. But I wouldn't necessarily expect to see that because, for example, the guidance in the LGA guide says that if you go up to 10 metres, you don't do anything. And then it goes, say, up to 15 metres. You can, as long as you put automatic ventilation in and you have upgraded FD30S doors. So I don't think you would expect to see a lot of calculation in there.
Sorry, just one more question. When you say, I would expect to see that if they were significantly excessive, so yes or no, are you saying that they weren't significantly excessive here, so you wouldn't expect to see any analysis of the travel distance?
No, I wouldn't, no. I think a reasonable person could reach a conclusion that the existing travel distances were not unduly excessive and therefore didn't need a specific consideration.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think that's a good moment for our break.
Yes.
There are more questions on this subtopic, but I think we should break now.
Right, thank you very much. Well, as you probably know, Mr. Lay, we have a break during the morning and this is the time to have it. So
Okay.
We'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And please, when you're out of the room, don't talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it.
Certainly.
All right, thank you very
Thank
much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you, Ms. Grange. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask Mr. Lay to come back in, please? Okay. Right, Mr. Lay, ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms.
Yes, thank you. Yes, now you tell us in your report that the existing smoke control system at Grenfell Tower, the one in existence before the refurbishment between 2012 and 2016, was a corridor smoke dispersal system. Can you just explain to the panel very briefly what a corridor smoke dispersal system was?
So it's a throwback to the 1960s guidance of CP3. So it's a method of effectively diluting smoke through sort of cross-flow and air flowing through the space.
Thank you. Now, if we go to the LGA guide again, CST 30014237, and look at page 96 now, and I want to look at 62.9, under the heading Unsatisfactory Smoke Control, and it says there, although there have been changes in smoke control design, it is still appropriate when assessing an existing building smoke control arrangements to review these in the light of the standards that were in place at the time the block was built. Start by ensuring that what is there continues to work as originally intended before considering the need to improve the arrangements. However, in relation to smoke dispersal, previous benchmark design guidance is far removed from what is acceptable today. And then we go on to the next paragraph, the next page. 62.10, smoke dispersal has proved to be very unreliable for a number of reasons and is no longer seen as an accepted method of smoke control. In existing blocks of flats with smoke dispersal, action should be taken to review both the smoke control arrangements and the existing travel distance. The advice of specialists may need to be sought. So can we agree that this would suggest, if following this part of the LGA guide, and certainly for compliance with the RRO, that there needed to be specific consideration of the smoke control arrangements and the existing travel distance, which may involve the advice of specialists?
I would say it need to be reviewed and considered, yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And documented as part of that review and consideration?
I think that would depend on, again, as I've said, it depends on the nature of the particular case. And I don't think at Grenfell it was a case where you would expect a huge amount of documentation.
You might not expect a huge amount of documentation, but correct me if I'm wrong, there's no consideration in any of the documentation dealing with the smoke control system of the extended travel distances, is there?
No, I wouldn't expect it to be in with the smoke control system. I'd expect it to be in the fire strategy.
So are you saying it was Exover's responsibility as part of the fire safety strategy for the proposed refurbishment works that there should have been consideration of extended travel distances in these lobbies?
I think there should have been, and I think it was mentioned in their existing building review document, fire strategy document, that there was a longer travel distance than you would have under current guidance, and that some form of ventilation was needed because of that.
Yes, Ms Cooney, in her existing fire safety strategy, not the one for the refurbishment,
correct,
noted
yes,
longer travel distances.
Yeah.
But there was no detailed consideration in any of the Exover documentation, was there, about extended travel distances in the lobbies and the effect that that might have?
No, I think it just said there was going to be some ventilation included. And
so
then, yeah. Mm-hmm.
You're saying that should have been in the fire strategy. We know it wasn't in the fire strategy for the refurbishment. Mm-hmm. It's not there. In those circumstances, would you have expected the designer of the system, PSB, to at least have given it some consideration in their documentation?
I think by the time PSB were involved, it was quite late on. So, again, I wouldn't necessarily expect the smoke control designer to do that. I think they would take the conditions as it's been sort of handed to them when they arrive late in the project. I mean, I would prefer if the person involved in designing the smoke control system was engaged much earlier, so they were engaged in those discussions. But when they're not, then I think it does. I wouldn't expect them to necessarily pick it up.
Right. So you would have expected the fire engineer to have put it in their fire safety strategy, but in circumstances where it was not in there, you wouldn't have expected the designer of the system to have picked that up and documented it.
Not in this sort of case, no, because it wasn't an obviously significantly excessive extended travel distance.
Right.
And to some extent, Exover did mention it because they said there needed to be an improvement to the smoke control system. And if you think back to, I think it was the previous page of the document that's on the screen, it talks about having some kind of smoke ventilation being included is a compensating feature. So, I mean, you could even argue that Exova did cover it within their fire strategy, but in the absolute bare minimum way. But you know, that's it's definitely in there, but it's not really covered about how they're going to achieve the smoke control.
No. And if we look at 6.2.11, it says an approach to 3 commonly found situations in which there are unsatisfactory smoke control provisions is as below, and there's some suggestions in here. And if we look at the 3rd bullet point, for example, it states in a single stairway blocks with corridor or lobby approach requiring smoke ventilation and with travel distances of 7.5 to 10 metres, OV, is that opening vents in corridors or lobbies, are acceptable up to 6 stories in height.
So an OV is an openable vent, so it's a manually operated vent. So that wouldn't have any bearing on a means of escape period, for example, because you'd expect firefighters to open those. An AOV is an automatic opening vent or ventilator. It can mean either. And a PV would be a permanent vent, so it's always open.
Yes. So if we look at the second sentence there, it says, if this travel distance exceeds 10 metres or the number of stories exceeds 6, so that's Grenfell, or the ventilation is provided in the stairway and not the corridor or lobby, AOVs or PVs are required. Do you see that?
Yeah, and I think that links back to what was included in Kate Cooney's existing building strategy.
Now, if we go back to your report, LAY 701, page 172, at paragraph 555 and following, you effectively say, in summary, that the lobby distances at Grenfell were ultimately not sufficiently problematic, such that any specific lobby protection expectations would be triggered. Is that right?
Yes.
And if you look at paragraph 556, you say this. You say, the travel pathway at Grenfell Tower was simple and familiar to residents. The extension of travel arose because of the extended corridor leg off the main space, and in line with the guidance in PD 7974 Part 6, no recommendation for increased time due to route complexity would be expected for this type of arrangement. Also, from that guidance, assuming smoke at the limit of tenability, one could add around 4 seconds to the travel time from an additional 2 metres of travel. This would not suggest a need for dedicated smoke control in the lobby. Now, I want to put to you, isn't 4 seconds actually rather a long additional time in the context of toxic smoke exposure?
No, and I think it was about 4 seconds between your question and my answer. So I don't think it is necessarily a particularly long time. And it would depend on the level of exposure that you're seeing. The level of exposure you'd expect while someone is escaping with the amount of smoke that's come out of a flat, I wouldn't expect 4 seconds to be a significant period of time. And again, I'm including this calculation, just like I referenced the LGA guide, to help understand the sort of thought process that a reasonably competent person might go through to ask themselves, is this travel distance excessive or not?
I understand that. The difficulty we've got is we've got no documentation that suggests that anybody at Grenfell went through that thought process, have we?
Well, it was mentioned in the existing fire strategy, and then we only have, as far as I can tell, the oral evidence from witnesses that say they did take it into account but didn't consider it to be. I think they felt it was so obvious that it wasn't a problem. And I could absolutely see how that would come about. I mean, that calculation tied up in that paragraph 556, I mentioned it within there, but there's lots of things to unpick there. You know, the fact that if you are looking at extended travel distances, you have to think about the complexity of the route, the familiarity with the route. You have to think about whether you're at the limits or not of tenability and the such like. So the calculation has got lots of different charts and tables you can pick those numbers from. But really that reflects an industry view, I would say. So it's putting a number on something that actually people would probably do qualitatively.
Right. You refer to the travel pathway as familiar. You've just mentioned it again. It might be familiar to residents who've lived there a while, but what if there are new residents in the tower or visitors or guests?
Well,
Does the travel distance calculations take that into account?
So I would say even if you're a new resident to the tower, you've probably found your way from the lifts to your flat, so you would be at least slightly familiar with it. And most guests are escorted in and out of the tower or would be with somebody who is in the tower. I wouldn't necessarily expect to have to take into account somebody who might come into the tower uninvited or with access without a resident there. That's at the fringes of what people would typically consider, because you're trying to deal with the typical condition in the vast majority of cases in a building.
Right. And does this assume, I mean, we know, and we'll come on to it, that it's expected that there'd be some smoke in the lobby, potentially quite early if there's a flat on fire. Yeah. Does this assume that the lobby is completely clear of smoke when you're doing these calculations? Or
No,
do you assume that there might be some impediment due to smoke?
So, as I've said in the paragraph, they're assuming smoke at the limited tenability. So that changes the walking speed of the person within the calculation. So I've used the value that assumes that there is smoke in the lobby.
Okay. Can we look at BS 9991 now? BSI 50621.
Sorry, can I ask, are we going to come back to PD 7974? Or?
No, I'm not coming back to it.
It's just worth noting that the application of PD 7974 Part 6 I've used there, if you go to the guidance document for 7974, it talks in there, in the frequently asked questions and the sections in there, about people making qualitative assessments and not always making quantitative and documented decisions. So it's not just me saying this is accepted within the industry and within the application of the building regulations, that people might sometimes make decisions that aren't fully documented.
I understand that, and I understand it may be industry practice. Is it industry good practice not to document, for example, that there was an extended travel distance, and have some consideration of what that might mean at Grenfell and whether compensatory measures are realistic or possible?
So I would say in a situation like Grenfell, it would be best practice if you documented it. I don't think it was such a significant travel distance that even good practice would necessarily pick it up. And I think the extent to which it was picked up, being mentioned in the existing fire strategy, being noted that there was going to be a repair to the smoke control system in the fire strategy, was probably about as far as I'd typically expect it to go. So that would be, classed as good practice.
So it's good practice simply to note that there's going to be a refurbished smoke control system and that there are extended travel distances, and leave it at that. That's good practice, is it?
I think it probably would be in a case like Grenfell Tower, because of the distances were relatively minor.
With no analysis, even cursory analysis. You've given your 4 seconds, but we see none of that in the documentation, do we?
So if I was doing it, I would provide a calculation or a reference back to something like the LDA guide to give some grounding to my opinion. And often a building control officer might ask you to put that in. But if you're dealing with a very experienced building control officer who understands all these things, they might not ask you to, and some fire engineers wouldn't do it. So I think there is a huge amount of variation in this when you've got this sort of case. If it was a much bigger distance, it would be a completely different circumstance, but it isn't.
And what do you mean by much bigger? What would trigger the need to document in a clear way an analysis of an extended travel distance?
I would say certainly over 15 metres.
Right. Now, if we go to clause 0.2.3 in this guide, it's at page 11. Here, it's called smoke control in common parts. Mm-hmm. And I want to read the second paragraph. It says, smoke can be controlled in the common areas through fitted ventilation systems, which are either natural or mechanical. These ventilation systems have 2 main purposes, the first of which is to provide some protection to the stair core, and the second of which is to aid firefighters when tackling a fire. Ventilation systems can also be used to compensate for extended travel distances within the common corridor, leading to the stairs and thereby help occupants to escape safely. Where smoke control is used to provide compensation for extended travel distances, it is the responsibility of the designers to demonstrate that the ventilation system can provide tenable conditions, see Annex E, for the occupants using the route with extended travel distances. So can we agree that this guidance was not followed at Grenfell Tower?
Well, not really, because it says where smoke control is used to provide compensation for extended travel distances.
I see. So you're saying because they decided, despite extended travel distances, that they weren't compensating for it, this wasn't triggered. Is that what you're saying?
I think that would be a reasonable interpretation of it, yeah.
Okay. So you don't interpret this guidance as saying where there are extended travel distances, which by definition might need some compensation, it's the responsibility of the designers to demonstrate that the system can provide tenable conditions.
In those circumstances, then it becomes that responsibility, yes.
Right.
But I think you have to also think about in the context of, again, this comes back to all the context we were talking about earlier of no less satisfactory and the such like, and you might look at it and say, well, hang on a minute, I do have a situation which is 2.5 metres, it's a well-understood lobby space, etc. Am I likely to see a comparison of tenability compared to the default condition of no ventilation versus a condition that has some ventilation in the space and a slightly longer distance? And you might do it qualitatively, which is provided for within the relevant frameworks.
I see. Let's look at the 2015 version of the Smoke Control Association guidance. That's at RBK 402932, and I want to look at page 6, clause 2.1. So here, in the second paragraph, it says, where the travel distances are no more than 7.5 metres in distance from the door to the staircase or sterile lobby to the most remote apartment entrance door, the primary objective of smoke control in residential buildings is to protect the staircase enclosure by ensuring that the stairways remain relatively free from smoke and heat in the event of a fire within a dwelling. And then if you go 2 paragraphs down from that, there's a paragraph beginning, however, the 4th paragraph. Mm-hmm. However, where corridors are extended, the primary objective of the smoke control system is to protect both the common corridor and the staircase enclosure. There are considered to be 2 forms of extended corridors, and it talks about extended corridors. And it says these typically have no more than 15 metres travel distance from the furthest apartment door to the staircase or sterile lobby. The primary objectives of the smoke control system are to protect the common corridor for means of escape and the staircase enclosure for means of escape and firefighting. Now, do you accept that this 2015 FCA guidance, if it was being followed, indicates that it wasn't permissible to treat protection of the stair as the primary objective, and instead the primary objective should have been both the common corridor, in this case the lobby, and the staircase?
Well, I would say if you read it prescriptively, yes, you would get that from it, but I wouldn't read it prescriptively.
Do you agree with Mr Hanson's view in his oral evidence to the inquiry that given the travel distances at Grenfell Tower, the design documentation for the system should have explained what approach was being taken to protecting both the stair and the lobby?
I wouldn't necessarily expect the design documentation to pick that up, but like I say, it should have been covered somewhere, and I think it was covered perhaps in the fire strategy, although not in a particularly explicit way or a way that I would like to see it done.
Have you seen any evidence that there was actually any discussion between the designers and approvers about these extended travel distances and whether there was a need to protect the lobby and or the stairs?
So there was discussion between designers and approvers about extended travel distances, but I think it was primarily associated with the internals of flats on levels 0 to 3. I don't recall seeing anything that said they specifically discussed that travel distance on the existing levels.
No. And would you have expected that to have been explicitly raised and considered?
I would certainly prefer it to be explicitly documented that it had been considered, but it could have been in a meeting, or they might have just, I don't know. It's hard to know. Not every decision gets documented, and I wouldn't like to speculate on what those people discussed.
Okay. Now, I want to ask you about documentation more generally now, and I want to look at the SCA guide, but the 2012 version of the SCA guide at LFB 3059241. This is the June 2012 Smoke Control Association guidance, and if we could go within it to page 5. Here we have the introduction, and if we look at the 5th paragraph down, there's a paragraph beginning 4. It says, for the design and approval process to be successful, it is strongly recommended that, except perhaps in the simplest cases, the system objectives, the scenarios to be calculated or modelled, the modelling criteria, the expected reporting and the success criteria are all agreed and documented prior to commencement of design. Do you see that?
I do see that, yeah.
And then if we go to page 14, under section 5, which is headed Objectives and Performance Criteria, and then there's a heading Documentation there, 5.4, it says this: results should be presented in an appropriate form for each agreed criterion. Sufficient information should be provided to allow relevant parties to assess the analysis undertaken in relation to checking and meeting the required performance criteria. The results of the analysis should be documented and may be provided in the form of a report, together with any necessary supporting animations from advanced modelling. The documentation should include at least the following information: a description of the residential area and the proposed ventilation system, the design criteria and performance objectives of the analysis, the scenarios investigated, details of the techniques used and related information, the results of the analysis, a statement as to whether the design criteria and objectives have been met. Do you see that?
I do see that, yeah.
So if you're adhering to this guide, one would expect to see all of those various aspects of the system documented.
Unless it was one of the, I think in the simplest of cases, I think it says at the start.
Yes. Would
So-
you have said Grenfell Tower was one of the simplest of cases?
I would say with regards to the issue of travel distance, yes. I would absolutely agree that there should be more design documentation and calculation provided for smoke control systems. I spend a lot of my time criticising other people for not doing precisely that and for insisting that we do that in the business that I work within. But I have to accept that not everybody does that. And I think one of the things we've seen, I think Dr. Lane sort of touches upon this within her report, which talks about the history of these systems, is that systems of this type, which is a mechanical shaft with an inlet via the stair, they've become, to some extent, an industry norm. You have companies that are producing sort of standardised products which have a standardised sort of pre-approval process for them. And one of the problems you have with the building regulations is that as things become a norm, people stop asking about the evidence to prove it. Sort of Regulation 7 and the guidance Regulation 7 kind of reinforces that as things become accepted practice, people stop questioning it. And particularly when it ends up into sort of guidance documents and published presentations and reports and the such like. So I'd be aware of that background to this, that my criticism is that not enough people do analyses of these types of systems, but I am very aware that a lot of people consider that these systems are well understood, sufficiently so that they don't need to do enough analyses and they can effectively fall back on what have become industry norms.
Yes, I appreciate many people might think that, but is that reasonably good practice? Is that reasonable practice to think that they're so well established, these systems, that one doesn't even have to think about documenting what we've just seen here?
I certainly don't think it's best practice, and I think in some certain building situations you could say it is good practice if it falls entirely within the boundaries of what's been modelled previously. It's certainly not what I like to see. My preference is absolutely to do more than that.
Just looking at that list, and perhaps if we go back a page so we can see the list again at the bottom. At Grenfell Tower, who do you say should have been responsible for ensuring that this documentation was prepared and available to use?
So I would normally expect it to be, in the ideal situation, a combination of two people. I'd expect the fire engineer to do a version of it, and then I'd expect the system designer to perhaps to complete that. Again, one of the criticisms I often make is that fire engineers don't do enough of the analyses to set all this stuff out, that it's pushed downstream, left to the system designer to do those analyses. So I'm very aware that varies from project to project in different cases. So I can't really say there's not even really a typical case. I have a preference, but I'm a fire engineer, so I expect the fire engineer to do more work. Right. Perhaps I'm slightly unusual in that regard. Some people expect fire engineers to do less work. But
Yeah.
I think
So here, are you saying primarily it should have been Exova as the fire engineer who should have made sure that this documentation covered at least these clearly key pieces of information according to this SCA guide?
I would say that's my preference, but I'm very much aware that other people have a different view. And so, yeah.
Other people have a reasonably different view that
It depends, because there are certainly competent people out there who design smoke control systems, and that's all they do, and they do their own analyses and such like, and they're experts in their own right, and involved, some of them involved in writing guidance and the such like. But then you also have situations where you have people effectively putting together ad hoc systems with no real experience. So it comes down to the individual competencies.
Yes. At Grenfell, we know this wasn't done by the fire engineer. So when PSB come into the project, you haven't got all these descriptions, you haven't got the scenarios investigated, you've got none of this. Would that put the onus on the system designer to make sure that the documentation covered these essential elements?
I think it would put the onus that there was sufficient information, yes.
What does that mean? Sorry, sufficient information. Are we talking about this?
It's in the first
documentation
paragraph.
Suggests it's at least this list.
Well, sufficient information should be provided to allow relevant parties to assess the analysis undertaken. And if there was no analysis, well, I guess you would expect to see less documentation. But I would expect it to be between the designers and the approvers to agree what is sufficient information.
And to include at least what we see in the list, the bullet point list.
Well, I mean, that list does kind of assume that you've carried out some form of detailed analyses. So if you've not carried out detailed analyses, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see that information, would you?
Well, this reads, I would suggest, that whether or not you've done a detailed analysis already, there needs to be documentation that includes at least the following things in these bullet points. Is that your evidence that that is?
Well, not wholly, because if you go back a couple of pages, there is an alternative pathway for setting out what the criteria for a system is, and it talks about if you're using a a velocity number, I think, then you might just effectively just put that in. So it's not necessarily the case that you would always do this level of detailed analyses. Again, it's my preference, but I accept that other people have a view on that.
Right. Now, just in terms of the design of the system, let's think back for a moment to the design of the original smoke control system at Grenfell Tower when it was built in the 1970s. Mr. Marnie, in his evidence, described this is at paragraph 18 of his second witness statement. He said it was a natural ventilation system with a mechanical boost function. Would you agree with that description?
I think that's a description, yeah.
Let's look at Dr. Lane's Phase 1 presentation now at BLA 405481, page 173. And we just need to rotate it round. So this is Dr. Lane's diagram of how the original smoke control system was meant to operate. Now, and is it right that effectively what we had was a pushing in at the south low level of airflow? We can see there's a shaft that you can see marked in blue, a pushing in of air, and there's some blue arrows into the lobby, and then a pulling out of smoke up to high level and to a fan at roof level. Is that how you understood the design intent of the original system to work?
So that's when the fire service have intervened and turned the fans on?
Yes.
Yeah.
So before that, it would be a natural system where air would naturally be drawn in at low level, go up,
Correct.
go through the lobby, come out.
Yes.
But yes, you're right. So it's got this mechanical boost, which means when the fire service want to, it can turn it into some form of mechanical operation by pushing in airflow and pulling out airflow. Yes?
Correct, yes.
Now, if we look at what you say about the existing system in your report, if we can go to page 114 of your report, I want to look at paragraph 346 and following. You say at the bottom of that page, the existing system had been designed as a corridor smoke dispersal system. It was intended to serve one floor at a time. And if we go on over the page, 347, you say there were a pair of smoke exhaust shafts on the north side of the building and a pair of inlet shafts on the south side of the building. In each lift lobby, there were two pairs of dampers, sometimes referred to as AOVs, serving these shafts, which were designed to open automatically when smoke was detected by sensors in a lobby. This allowed smoke to exhaust up the shafts on the north side of the building to the outside at roof level. Fresh make-up air could enter through the shafts. And you say, using the taxonomy I set out in part 1, the existing system was a hybrid system that used natural shafts and had the option for a mechanical extract boost. A natural shaft system could activate automatically prior to the fire service's arrival, with natural exhaust shafts on the north side and a natural inlet from shafts on the south side. Fans were also provided for the fire service to achieve if they wanted. These would extract via the north side at the top of the building and supply via the south shaft at the walkway level. Hence, it was a hybrid by being a natural shaft type system during means of escape, but which could be a mechanical extract system after fire service arrival. And can we also look at page 168 and what you say at paragraph 540.1? You say, and we looked at it earlier, but just to be clear, that the existing system sought to protect the lobby and by consequence to provide a degree of protection to the stair. Is that correct?
Yes.
So what would the performance objectives have been for the existing system if you'd been setting them down?
I think the performance objective was to some extent the same, that they wanted to protect the staircase. Whether they wanted to protect the lobby is an interesting question. So what I mean by that is, they're protecting the lobby space, and by that they're protecting the staircase. Whether they meant to protect the lobby as a result of an extended travel distance is an interesting question, and one which is difficult to answer because we're not back at the end of the 1960s when they were doing the design for this building. But CP3 allowed you to have, which is the old guidance, allowed you to have a travel distance of up to 15 metres.
Yes.
And they were much shorter than that. So I don't think it wouldn't be right to infer that just because they were designing under that guidance, that they were definitely designing to that performance objective, because they were also doing a very innovative system. I think I mentioned in my report, I don't know of an older building that has a centralised lobby with a ventilation system in this country.
Okay.
I think it's so. I would be careful about inferring what the performance expectations were from CP3, because they were clearly looking at this as a bespoke building.
I see. But can we agree that the existing system does appear to be primarily trying to protect the lobby by pushing fresh air in and extracting the smoke out?
It's certainly looking to achieve the protection to the building via the lobby space, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, when Mr. Marnie gave oral evidence to the inquiry, he told us that he'd been told, he didn't say who he'd been told by, that the original system didn't have a supply fan at low level and only an extract fan in the north shaft at the top of the building. Are you able to shed any light on that in terms of the documentation you've read?
I'm sorry, I can't, no.
Yeah. But it sounds like you do agree with Dr. Lane this much, that the design guidance CP371, which was in place at the time and appears to have been the design guidance that inspired Grenfell Tower, had as performance objectives, first, the protection of the common lobbies for means of escape, second, the protection of the stair for means of escape, and also the protection to firefighters when using the common lobbies or corridors. Can we agree that those were the performance objectives of CP371?
Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, if we turn to the system that was actually installed at Grenfell Tower, if we go within Dr. Lane's Module 3 report at BLARP 2, 5035, page 260. Here, if we blow it up, we can see an illustration of how the new smoke control system was designed. And what we can see is that rather than smoke being pushed in at south level 2, what's happening is smoke is being extracted at that level, yes?
Sorry, you mean rather than fresh air being ejected from that level?
Sorry. Rather than fresh air being pumped in at the south through the south shafts to push and then have a pull position, instead what we've got is smoke being exhausted at that south level.
Yes.
And smoke also being exhausted, so it's a pull-pull rather than a push-pull.
Yes, you could say that, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And if we go on to figure 7.6 and the next page, at page 261, this shows the design intent on a floor plan. And it's right, isn't it, that the blue arrows indicate effectively that fresh air is intended to be provided through the stairs through the roof vent, which is at the top of the stairs, and through the door into the direction of the lobby, yes?
Yes.
Those are the blue arrows. And then smoke is to be extracted through the north and south shafts, the pairs of north and south shafts that we can see in red with red arrows, yes?
Yes.
And is the system intended, in your view, to extract smoke from the lobby? Was that the primary performance objective, or was the primary performance objective to achieve airflow across the door?
So the objective is to protect the staircase. And to do that, this type of system, there's three effects it induces. There's extraction of smoke, there is an induced flow through the doorway, and then there's also, as a result of that, a dilution effect as well.
Had you been designing or assisting with the design of this system, would you have had any concerns about relying on the existing location of the south shaft dampers for extracting smoke, given that they were low on the floor? So we know, we can look at a photo if we need to, but that the south shaft had vents at low level and the north shaft had vents at much higher level. Now, would you have had any concerns about the idea of extracting smoke from the south, through the south shafts, but using very low vents?
So I think you'd have to think about it, and a lot of it comes down to experience. If this was a much sort of longer corridor type design, you'd expect that to potentially change the dynamics of the smoke, because in a nice long corridor you get a nice stratified layer of smoke, and if you're pulling down at one end and pulling out at a high level at the other end, you might disturb that. But to be perfectly honest, in a smaller lobby type situation, you end up with so much turbulent air that it doesn't make a huge amount of difference.
So you wouldn't be concerned that the smoke would rise in the lobby, and therefore if you're trying to assist with smoke control in the lobby in the early stages of the fire, it's not likely to be helpful to be taking it from very low level?
I don't know how much of an effect it would have on it, but I don't think in a lobby of this size it would necessarily have a significant effect on that. Like I say, the turbulence effects that you're likely to see in that sort of space are probably going to mean it doesn't make a huge amount of difference.
What about extracting smoke downwards through the south shaft? So previously air was being pushed up through the south shaft to go through the lobby. Now this design involves pulling air through those extraction vents and downwards, down the building. Would you have had any concerns about that?
I wouldn't say a concern, but I would say it's a more difficult thing to design, because you've got you're fighting against gravity. You know, smoke likes to rise, so you're going to have to pull it down through a shaft. Then you're going to have to take that into account with your fans. You might get a lower extract rate from that side than you would from the other side, for example.
Yes. Now, just in terms of your overall view, just help me with this, and I'm going to try and summarise your view. In your report, you're critical of Exover's outlined fire safety strategy, which you say didn't set out the purpose of the smoke control system and what was to be achieved by it. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think, as I said earlier, it set the very bare minimum that you might interpret.
And is it right, therefore, that you agree with Dr. Lane that you would have expected the fire engineer to take a lead role in setting the performance objectives and monitoring the delivery of those objectives on a system like this?
That is what I think a fire engineer should do, yes.
And are you critical of Exover for not doing that in this situation?
Yes, yeah.
And you also appear to be critical of Max Fordham. You say that they prepared smoke control proposals, revision A and then revision B, and you're critical of them for not setting out the functional performance of the system, what it was intended to achieve, or the basis for their proposed extract rate. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, because they were basically presuming they were just going to copy the existing system.
And you are therefore critical of work done before PSB's involvement, and you say it hadn't adequately addressed and documented the areas to be protected, yes?
Yeah, because if we think back to what the LGA guys said, it talks about the existing systems, you should be wary of them, you should try and improve upon them, etc. And Max Fordham hadn't considered that option at all, really. They just said, well, we're just going to... I mean, they were going to make some improvements, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
But not substantially to the mode of operation.
Yeah. And you're also critical of Studio E in your report. This is at paragraph 404, page 133 for the transcript, where you say Studio E, as architects, should have been very concerned that the smoke control provision was not properly resolved at the end of stage D. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
So you're critical of Exova, you're critical of Max Fordham, and you're critical of Studio E.
Yes.
Are you critical of PSB in terms of the way in which they went about designing this system, the planning of it?
I think I have been critical about the level of documentation that was provided of PSB in terms of design and the such like. It's not the level that I would like to see.
They didn't set, did they set clear performance objectives and scenarios to be investigated, thinking back to the LGA guide, the SCA guide?
No, they didn't, but wasn't that only if you have significantly extended travel distances or a non-simple case? And I think they probably thought it was a simple case.
Now, in terms of this system, is it right that your view is that this was a mechanical extract natural inlet system where the inlet was via the stair? Is that right?
Yes.
But isn't it right that this system didn't have a permanent natural inlet air supply, as would be expected for those types of systems?
Well, it's a version. So if it's an inlet via the stair, which is the system type I described, you wouldn't expect it to have a permanent inlet. The inlet would come via the staircase. That's the purpose of that description.
Wasn't this a system where natural leakage, mainly around the stair door, was relied upon for replacement air supply to the lobby?
So during the means of escape phase, when the fans are running in a lower mode, yes, it would draw air in around, for example, from the staircase to create some benefit in the lobby.
Can we agree that the more accurate description of the system is a mechanical extract-only system, as described in the SCA Guide 2015?
Well, I don't think it is, because the point is, it's quite important to make the point that the inlet is provided when you open the door, because you're trying to protect the staircase. So that's the description I would use.
Is the reason you're reluctant to categorise this system as a mechanical extract-only system because the SCA Guide 2015 warns that such systems are unsuitable where extended travel distances occur?
No, that's not why I say that. I've set out a whole taxonomy of smoke control systems, and I think describing where the inlet comes from is part of the description of the system, because it helps you understand the different mechanisms that are used to protect the staircase.
Right. Now, Dr. Lane's evidence in her supplemental report is that typically a multidisciplinary team comprising mechanical engineering, fire safety engineers, and commissioning expertise would be required to design smoke ventilation systems in such a building as Grenfell Tower. And she says that in her experience, smoke ventilation systems require one of the largest arrays of relevant professionals to ensure adequate performance. Now, do you agree with that?
I would say it's certainly one of the most complex things to design in buildings, arguably more so in new buildings, but also in existing buildings as well. So, yeah, you do need an array of professionals to do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But then again, you need that for pretty much anything as well. But, yeah, I think maybe I've got a bias because I spend a lot of my time designing smoke control. But yeah, I think it is a complex and difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And paragraph 9 of your report, if we could just look at your report at page 14, you say, picking it up in the second line, you say, I've used my own expert engineering experience to consider whether a reasonably competent person would, in the circumstances, have made the same substantive design decisions as those taken by the systems designers. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And are you assessing the adequacy of the smoke control system design against that which might reasonably be expected from what system designers or what you would expect from a reasonably competent fire engineer?
I would say from the team as a whole, so all those parties. And I'm, again, I have to be careful here because I don't like to blow my own trumpet, but I am considered to be an expert in this area, so I'm expected to know a bit more than most fire engineers would know, and I might know a bit more than some other people would know. But I've applied that experience in that particular case. So I would expect the overall team to have come up with the same sort of design decisions.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In your opinion, would it have been relevant to any non-worsening approach that one would need to be comparing that against the performance criteria and the function of the existing system, which may well have been there to protect the lobby, not just the stair?
I think that's one way of doing it, but in this particular case, I think there's general agreement that the system wasn't going to be very good at meeting the criteria that it was thought to be designed for, that it may not have been particularly effective. And in fact, that effectiveness would have varied depending on which level you test the system on as well. So it's not particularly good. It doesn't provide the same level of protection throughout the whole building and things like that. So I think you might take it into account. That's one way of doing it. But at the same time, if you didn't think it was going to be very effective at dealing with, for example, extended travel distances, then it's setting a lower benchmark, isn't it, for the no less satisfactory consideration.
Right. In terms of the basis for the PSB design, do you agree with Dr. Lane's conclusion that the design documentation doesn't provide any evidence that either CP3 1971 or any of the approved documents were considered as a means to derive design objectives, nor were performance criteria set on that basis? Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, yes. The documentation doesn't set it out, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And in terms of PSB's design, is it your view that PSB effectively took the design back to the beginning and was seeking to provide a new system which could achieve the performance aligned to contemporary standards?
I think, yeah, compared to the Max Fordham approach, that is, yes, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Ms Menzies has said that no information was provided regarding the working of the existing system, and as such it was not demonstrated that the various amended proposals would result in a no worse situation. Do you agree with that?
Well, there was some understanding regarding the for example, the nature of the dampers, the operation of the control system or lack thereof. There were some calculations done by Max Fordham of what the natural flow might be. But I think the thing that was missing, the fans were actually there. When I visited Grenfell Tower after the fire, the fans from the original smoke control system appeared to still be there, but they weren't operable and they weren't running and they'd been moved and disconnected. So
at north and south level?
Certainly at roof level. Whether that may have also been the fans from lower level taking up there, I don't know.
Yes.
But there was certainly ventilation equipment up there.
Right, because Mr Marnie's evidence was that there might not have been a fan at low level. But are you saying you saw that fan or not?
I wouldn't have seen a fan at level 2 because it was completely remodelled.
Yeah.
But certainly up at the rooftop plant room, there was still discarded ventilation plant up there. I think the only evidence I can recall right now about there being fans at level 2 was I think some of the discussions about when the fans, I think the original proposal from PSB was simply the fans were going to be at roof level, but that was probably before they'd been and visited the building. Then there was a discussion on site, if I remember rightly, and decision was taken. And I think the comment that was made was to put them where the previous fans had been at level 2. And I think that's probably where my understanding of the fact that there were previous fans there comes from.
Right, thank you.
Ms Grange, do you mind if I just ask
No,
a question
course.
about... We've referred once or twice to the non-worsening principle. And if I've understood it correctly, the original system was a natural ventilation system until the fire brigade turned on the extract fan on the roof. So from the point of view of people trying to leave a flat on a fire floor, there would be a degree of smoke clearance by a natural draft mechanism across the lobby. And when they got to the stairs, there might be some inflow of air from the stairs, but that wasn't the primary purpose. So the stairs might or might not be fairly free. So with the new system, you actively seek to protect the stairs by extracting smoke from the lobby. But you're introducing a new factor, which is the clearance of the stairs, or at least the protection of the stairs. How do you go about determining non-worsening when you've got two systems which are designed to do essentially different things?
It's complex, isn't it? Yeah. You could break it back down to you could have, for example, you could have taken the existing system, simply repaired the dampers, you could have run the fans, got a calculation and put in exactly the same flow rates and said that's definitely no worse. Okay. As soon as you start changing the mode, it does get more complicated. And I think there's a number of ways of looking at that, and I think the way it seemed to be interpreted at Grenfell Tower, I'm taking this from looking at people like Mr. Hanson's evidence in context, etc., and such like, is that they kind of said, look, we know that dispersal systems and the old type of system isn't particularly well regarded these days. Be a little bit cautious about that because Grenfell was quite an odd dispersal system as well. But we know that's not particularly well regarded. We don't think the shafts are very big. It doesn't look like it's going to be doing much. But let's look at trying to adopt something that's closer to current guidance, where the staircase is the primary focus. The travel distances don't look to be unduly excessive. Yeah, that would be no less satisfactory. So it's quite a qualitative judgment, but I could certainly see how they would come to that opinion.
So the advantage, you think, was the priority given to keeping the stairs clear of smoke, which the new system would provide.
Yeah.
That was betterment, if anything, is it?
Yes, yeah, I'm careful of the word betterment. I know it has a legal meaning and such like. But yeah, I think it was an improvement. Because I think the previous presumption was that if we do a bit of smoke dilution or smoke dispersal on the lobby, that will protect the staircase. And what we've discovered is that doesn't necessarily work out very well. And in a building that does have, not unduly excessive travel distances, the staircase is what really matters. I mean, if we'd had the existing system running on the night of the fire, I think conditions would have been pretty disastrous much earlier. I mean,
it's difficult to do a non-worsening calculation if you don't know what the base is from which you're starting.
It is tricky. And like I say, if you were taking the most simple case of, right, we're going to replace like for like, but we're going to put slightly better dampers in, a slightly better control system in, but we're going to use the same ventilation rate, then you definitely hit non-worsening by that regard. And that kind of, you might say, sets a minimum standard. Right. But if what we're going to do is we're going to apply a modern way of thinking, and do the best we can towards that, but take into account the existing building constraints, then you would also say that's non-worsening.
Oh, thank you very much.
Or no less satisfactory. Sorry, apologies if I use both terms. But
no, I think we understand each other.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Ms. Green.
Okay, thank you. Now, I want to look in a little bit more detail about PSB's design, in particular with reference to leakage paths, to start with. Can we look at the SCA Guide 2012 again? Before we do, it's right, isn't it, that the SCA Guide provides recommendations regarding the need to consider open doors when designing a mechanical smoke ventilation system, because any such system needs to address the foreseeable scenarios which will occur when the system is operating.
Yes.
And it's right, isn't it, that both the 2012 and 2015 SCA guides provide indicative examples of design conditions, including consideration of the stair and flat entrance doors opening at different times and different durations during both the escape phase and the firefighting phase, respectively.
Yes, there's a timeline within the guide for that. Yeah,
let's have a look at that typical timeline for this is a time-dependent design. It's a LFB 30599241. And I want to look at page 13. This is table 5.3 at the bottom of the page, headed Typical Timeline for Time-Dependent Design. And you've got various stages. I'm not going to go through all of them, but let's look, for example, at the last few stages in that event. We can see in the last 4 lines, you've got apartment window breaks, door to stair opens, fire service arrival, and remains open. That's because the fire service may be propping it open with their hoses, yes?
Yep.
Then door to the fire dwelling opens, fire service inspection, and door to the fire dwelling opens, fire service arrival, yes?
That's correct, yeah.
So we can see that the effect there is that as the firefighting begins, you've got different door opening conditions, which a designer ought to be considering as part of a smoke control design, yes?
Yeah, I think they would, although I'd just be careful. This table is for use when you're actually doing a time-dependent design and doing the detailed analyses. So there may be other ways of doing your calculations or evaluating your system characteristics, which wouldn't necessarily follow analyses that looked at each of these particular points, but you'd expect it still to address those points.
Yes, so would you agree that the designers ought to at least be considering what the different scenarios are during both the escape phase and the firefighting phase?
Yes.
And there's a comparable table in the SCA guide, the 2015 SCA guide. I don't think we need to go to it, but again, it's got stair door opening, fire service arrival, and door to the apartment fully opens as some of the scenarios to work through.
Yeah.
Now, having read, therefore, the SCA guides, which we certainly had the 2012 guide at the time that PSB was doing its design work, shouldn't PSB have made allowances for different door opening conditions as part of their design?
So I think the design would need to take into account providing protection when all the relevant doors are open, yes. Whether you would necessarily do a detailed design on that would depend upon the method you're using to justify the design. I mean, this is for the one on the screen is for a time-dependent design approach. If you're doing a steady-state approach, you might only compare a couple of extreme conditions. So let's say, for example, you're comparing what a natural ventilation shaft might achieve compared to a mechanical shaft. You might only do a steady-state calculation for one of these conditions, most likely the firefighting condition. So you do take into account, or your system needs to be able to cope when the relevant doors are open, yes.
Yes. Now, in her reports, Dr. Lane concludes that she can't identify any time period in the early stages of the Grenfell Tower fire where only the stair door was open as per the system's design condition. For example, she points to the fact that the sole use of the stair for means of escape ended by just after 1 in the morning, 1 minute past 1 in the morning, when the first firefighters entered Grenfell Tower. Now, doesn't that indicate that one single stair door being open, with all the other doors being closed on the relevant fire floor, was an unrealistic design assumption to make?
So if we look at that timeline that's on the screen at the moment, we assume that the person comes out of the flat that's on fire, the door closes behind them, they go to the staircase, they open that door, and that's the case, the staircase is the only door that's open. There were situations, I think, during the early stages of the fire on level 4, for example, when that may have happened. But then again, we also have a situation at Grenfell Tower where a lot of the doors didn't close behind residents. But that wouldn't have been necessarily the designed for condition, and certainly wouldn't be anticipated in the SCA guide, which would presume that doors shut behind people.
In your report, if we look at your report at page 155, paragraph 496, you say this: you're dealing with the type of system specified by PSB, and you say, so by contrast, a mechanical extract system with a natural inlet via the stair can be defined by performance criteria of the 2 meters per second velocity through the open stair door. That was the performance criteria set by PSB. This is readily measurable, and there only need be knowledge of the door area to enable the system to be appropriately specified. And then you go on to say, ideally, leakage rates from the lobby would also be known, but they can be accounted for by adding an allowance to the volume flow rate for the fan. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, just help us, where you're referring to leakage rates from the lobby, what exactly do you mean by leakage rates there?
So there I'm talking about the air that might come through from other doors and around cracks and the such like, and lift shafts and everything else, yeah.
Yeah, so we've been talking about open doors, like open flat doors. That's one area of leakage. We know there's a lift shaft at Grenfell Tower. We know there are service rises going through. So there could be leakage from a number of different pathways in that lobby. Can we?
Yeah, I would tend to think of leakage in terms of, smaller cracks, non-specific leakage pathways within the building construction. Yeah.
And just help us with this. It's a simple question, but just so we're all completely understood, how do leakage rates potentially affect the performance of a system like the one which PSB designed, including its ability to protect the stair?
So if you didn't take that into account, when you put your fan in and you turned it on, you'd be drawing some air from those other leakage pathways, and you would end up with a lower velocity at the door. Yeah. So you'd have to increase your fan speed to take into account those extra leakage rates.
Yeah. Now, if we look at paragraph 572 on your report, page 176, you say there, if inadequate extract is provided, then more smoke can enter the stair, and when this is coupled with inadequate make-up air, this can result in increased smoke entering the corridor or lobby and migrating to the stair. This type of effect can occur in an undersized mechanical extract system using push-pull, or undersized mechanical extract with natural shaft inlet. So the latter being the type you say was installed at Grenfell Tower, yes?
I'm not sure. I think in this section here, I'm discussing some of the differences between different system types.
Right.
So I'm not entirely sure that that's being read in context if I think what you're going to say is next. But
Okay. But you then go on and you say, it is important, therefore, that systems such as these are fully calculated on a case-by-case basis because they are more sensitive to the building physics, yes?
yeah, so what I'm referring to there is in particular where you have systems that use multiple shafts. So that's absolutely my preferred design for smoke control, particularly where you have extended corridors, is you have more than one shaft. But to actually get those to work, you have to be aware of the fact that it's got to protect the lobby, and it's also got to create a flow through the staircase. So it's much more sensitive to the building physics. So that's what I'm referring to there is that type of system.
Right. But can we agree that it was important that a system like the one at Grenfell Tower was fully calculated on a case-specific basis because it would also be sensitive to building physics?
Well, no, because I'm talking about calculation here from a different perspective. So it's important that the fan could achieve the necessary flow rate, and you've got two ways of doing that. You can either have a guess at what you think the extra leakage might be and stick a bit on your fan speed, and you might argue that's a slightly less efficient way of doing it. You might end up with a bigger fan than you needed, or you might end up with still not a big enough fan and have to go and replace it or tweak the fan. You can tweak fans to produce a bit more power. What I'm talking about here is the actual protection mechanism being much more complicated and needing to be calculated.
Right, I see.
I think that's a section.
And here
it's
with
in,
PSB,
yeah.
they took the former, didn't they? They basically had a guess at what the leakage might be and stuck on a bit for the fan. Yes, is that fair?
I believe they applied their experience or engineering judgment to it. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, we don't see any. We don't have any documentation that shows any kind of calculations about leakage or any analyses, whether they be hand calculations or anything more sophisticated, do we? We don't have those.
That's right, yeah, yeah. And to be honest, you wouldn't necessarily, I mean, even in the more detailed calculations, you wouldn't necessarily try and work out every single leakage path. You would always stick a bit on at the end to make sure that the fan that's put in and the shafts that you design are big enough to accommodate it. It's one of the biggest challenges I find in designing smoke control systems is that your leakage paths change throughout the design process. They can change in the lifetime of a building as well. So you have to be very careful about that, and you make allowances.
Okay.
There's nothing worse than designing a building where your shafts aren't big enough and they've started building it. It's very difficult to undo.
And do you agree with Dr. Lane that some mechanical calculations for pressure drop also ought to have been carried out when PSB was selecting its fan sizes for the new system?
So to specify a fan, you take into account the flow rate and the pressure drops you want to use, and you do that using a fan curve, which was included in the technical submissions. So I presume, I mean, typically when you're picking a fan, and I think with the Elta ones that they used at Grenfell Tower, there's a calculator that you go online and you type in the various dimensions that you need, and it tells you which fan works, and it
Right.
prints out a fan curve, which tells you whether the fan can deliver required pressure drops.
Right. Can we agree, therefore, that for the type of system designed by PSB, the following important work ought to have been carried out? First, the system should have been fully calculated, taking into account the foreseeable door opening conditions and any other leakage should a fire in a flat occur.
Okay, I would certainly prefer it to be done like that, but I can understand in the industry why it's come about that isn't done. Because people have looked at what's become the industry norms, or they've done their own modelling on previous projects, and they've developed, they know what extract rate is needed to provide protection to the staircase, and therefore what they're really looking to do is provide an extract rate, and then because it's hard to measure an extract rate on site, they convert that back into a velocity that they achieve through the door in a commissioning state, which would be just a single door open. And my understanding from Mr. Marnie is that that's what he did.
I see. Can we look at paragraph 1429 of your report now on page 431?
Mm-hmm.
So at 1429, you say, Dr. Lane has also been critical in her Phase 2 smoke control report of the absence of calculations, considering the potential impact on the system from doors to flats on the fire floor, including the fire flat, being open at the same time as the stair door. Such criticism is, however, not substantiated by an explanation or analysis of the competing resistance pathways that would occur. I have included in part 2 some basic flow pathway calculations, which confirm that flow from the stair should remain the path of least resistance, even when a flat front door is open. A similar point was expressed by Mr. Marnie in his oral evidence. Now, taking this in stages, is it right that in your report, the report from last August, you've carried out some leakage calculations yourself to assess the extent to which the airflow through the stair would be affected when, for example, a flat door was open with a pathway to air on the outside of the building?
I included some calculations to help explain that effect, yes.
Yeah. No such calculations were carried out by PSB at the time this system was designed. Is that right?
Not that I'm aware of, yeah.
No. Should such calculations have been carried out by a reasonably competent designer of one of these systems?
Again, that's my preference, that they are calculated out on a case-by-case basis, but I also understand that an engineer might take a value they've used on another project, knowing that that's worked, and applied that.
Did it fall below the standards of a reasonably competent designer not to carry out those calculations?
It's difficult to say because, like I say, I have to be very careful here not to put forward just what my preference is. My preference is that it's done on a case-by-case basis, and that's the way I think it should be done. Whether it's okay to use previously calculated designs is difficult to argue. It's difficult to argue against that because there are systems out there that use previously calculated numbers and put that forward as a standard design. So I think there are people who certainly believe that in the industry. So I think there's a range of views available on that.
I appreciate there might be a range of views. In your opinion, does it fall below the standards of a reasonably competent designer not to do those calculations?
I don't think I can say it definitely does. I'd like to be able to say it does. I'd like to be able to say that people should definitely do that. But I can't really say it does because I think a lot of people, particularly those in the practical installation end of smoke control systems, feel that there's enough analysis done and that they can rely on the previous studies that have been carried out.
Okay. Now, I'm going to go back, looking back at paragraph 1429, it's still on the screen. We can see that you say there that on the basis of your calculations, you can confirm that the stair should remain the path of least resistance, even when a flat front door is open. And you use this phrase, path of least resistance, a number of times in your report. And indeed, Mr. Marnie used it once in his evidence. What exactly do you mean when you say that the stair is the path of least resistance when the stair and the flat door are open?
So if you're extracting from a volume such as the lobby space, and there are two primary pathways we're considering of air getting to that lobby, either, for example, coming from outside, through a flat, through a kitchen window, through a doorway, through a hallway, into the lobby, or coming through a staircase door from a vent at the top, I'm saying which one has the lower resistance to airflow, and therefore that will determine which one has the majority of the airflow coming through it.
Yes. Now, is path of least resistance a technical term that we see defined in any of the relevant standards or guidance documents?
I don't think it is. I use that term because you will have seen the calculation I used in my report. People might be familiar with that from sort of high school physics, when you calculate the resistance in a network for electrical reasons and fluid flows and such like. It's a standard calculation. So I used that term because I thought it would be familiar and accessible for people.
Yes, you see, Dr. Lane says in her report that that's not a concept that she recognises, and that what's important is that you work out by how much does your flow through the stair reduce when you've got these leakage rates. Forget which is still has more air going through it. What you really need to know is whether your flow rate through your stair door has been compromised and by how much. Now, do you agree with that?
Well, you do that by working out what the different resistance pathways are.
Exactly.
And that's a term I would use. I started off my career as an academic in fluid dynamics. I've worked in research in fluid dynamics, and I've used that term multiple times to describe different complex networks and the such like, including research work I've done. So I think it is a term that I think is applicable to use. But the process you've just described there, Dr. Lane saying the important thing is to work out whether or not you're getting enough flow through your doorway. To do that, you do a resistance calculation.
Yes.
Can I just ask you this? We're postulating a situation in which a flat door is open and there is a pathway to air from the flat.
Yeah.
To what extent does the airflow through the flat front door depend on the size of the opening to the outside?
It is critically affected by it. So the calculation relies. It's a inverse square relationship when you add them all up and such like. If you put the calculation on the screen, I could talk you through it. But yeah, having for example, let's say you had two doorways. Let's say the stair door and the flat door were both exactly the same size. If your window, the other side of a stair door, was only 1 square metre, but it was 2 square metres on the other side from the staircase, you would have a much lower path of resistance from the staircase compared to the flat.
Well, that's how it struck me as a matter of common sense. But I asked the question because the size of the opening to air on the outside of the flat will be inherently uncertain, won't it? Because they might have a broken window as a result of the fire, or there might be large areas of windows left open. I mean, how does one account for that?
Yeah. I mean, window breakage is one of the most complicated areas of fire engineering, and it affects everything from smoke control through to structural engineering design and the such like. It's quite an interesting area as well. We've had a lot of concerns over the years as fire engineers about people putting in more modern sort of double glazing windows. There was a big concern from America a few years back that it actually restricts ventilation, that those windows don't break readily in a fire, and you end up with a hot, vitiated combustion condition that leads to what's called a backdraft when the fire service open the door. That doesn't seem to have been the case at Grenfell Tower, interestingly enough. I think the overall, there's probably a lot of plastics in the overall external construction meant that there was window failure. But window failure also doesn't tend to happen with the whole window going. You tend to get breakage, fracturing. It's a very, very complicated area, so it's hard to work out. Yeah.
I can understand the difficulties.
Yeah.
We're now talking about the design stage.
Sure.
And what's being suggested is one ought to do a calculation to compare the inflow from the stairs and the inflow from the flat to the lobby.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what you take as the postulated size of the opening to air on the other side of the flat front door, which would seem to me to be inherently uncertain.
So yeah, when I do that sort of calculation within a model, or I work with my team to do that sort of calculation, you've got to be quite careful as well, because you might think that, well, a small opening makes is better, or a big opening is better, but your opening to outside is probably also where most of your ventilation for the fire is coming from. So if you have a big opening, you get potentially a slightly bigger fire, and you get a lower resistance pathway, but at the same time you will also see smoke flowing straight out of that window as well. So we tend to model it, for example, with a relatively small opening at low level, so the smoke can't get out, to put the system under more stress. But that's the way we model them. We're doing a fully calculated design. But you're right, there's a very complicated relationship between the amount of ventilation the fire has, so how big the fire is, the amount of smoke that will actually eject straight out of that window, which can be quite a substantial quantity, and also then the amount of smoke that goes the other way. It is you're right, an inherently difficult and complicated relationship. So you tend to rely upon, we tend to model it and do a number of different cases, for example, to take that into account. But a lot of people have modelled this stuff. There's a lot of people who've done analyses for these types of systems, and some people consider that enough analysis has been done. I don't. I think you should do it each time. But yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms.
Thank you. Yes, I want to go within Dr. Lane's supplemental report now to where she's effectively responded to your calculations, and we've got a number of very helpful visual diagrams which help look at your respective positions. Can we start, though, if we look at BLARP 25043 at page 163. And at paragraph 7.4.11, where she's looking at the stair flow path, she says that you have overestimated in your calculations the size of the door opening between the stair and the lobby. At 7.4.14, we can see that she says that your calculations assume the stair was just over 2 metres square, when in fact it was only 1.68 metres square. Now, do you accept that?
Actually, no. I think there's probably a small typo in my report, which I need to have a look at. But I have a recollection when I did that calculation that I took into account the actual full size of the stairhead vent, which is where you get a slightly different answer from as well. I don't think I took into account a 2 square metre doorway.
Right. And she's tried to work backwards from your calculation to work out what size of stair door opening you were assuming.
Well, but she's also assumed that the vent at the top of the staircase was only 1 square metre. And I think it was actually slightly bigger than that. So I think that's where the difference is. And it'd be wrong to back calculate like that.
Just in terms of how you go about calculating this, the methodology, if we look back to page 160...
Can I just say as well, I think the answer she came out with was 0.989 square metres. And I've quoted it as 0.9 square metres. So I don't think...
It's not a huge difference.
It's a very, very small difference.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. No, I have to put these points to you.
Sure, yeah.
If we go back to page 160 of her report, she explains that the relevant British standards, when you're making these calculations, refer to 2 types of leakage path. There are parallel leakage paths and there are series leakage paths. And if you look at the top of page 161, which is, I think, helpful, at 7.3.6, she says, to understand why leakage paths are treated in parallel or in series, you can see the relevant bit of the British Standard. So a parallel path occurs where all the doors opening out of a stair lead directly to an unpressurised space. And then leakage paths in series occur where there's an intermediate space into which air from another pressurised space first flows before finally leaking out to the unpressurised space through other leakage paths. And if you go to the diagram below, as I understand it, what she's saying is for the flat, you have to do leakage paths in series because you've got potentially a window opening going to the outside, then you've maybe got a kitchen door, and then you've got an open flat door. So you look at those in series, but then when you're looking at the total effective leakage area to the lobby, you look at those in parallel because you've got leakage coming through the stair and leakage from the flat. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's quite a nice diagram, yeah.
Yeah. So can I take it that there's no disagreement between you about the methodology by which you can go about calculating these respective leakage paths?
Yeah, that's just basic physics, yes.
Yeah. And at 7.37, yes, we've got that methodology. And then if we go to figure 7.4 at page 164, if we can blow this figure up, what she has done is she has shown in visual form the scenarios that you've considered in your calculations. And we can see that in yellow is an opening to an area, and in green is a partial door closure. So to take your case 1, what we've got is at the bottom, the space of the roof ventilator, then we've got the stair door opening, the flat entrance door opening, the kitchen door opening, and then we've got a little window opening there. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then you've done 3 different case scenarios. You've done a different case scenario where you've got a partially closed flat entrance door opening, yes?
Yeah.
And then you've done another case scenario, case 3, where you've got a kitchen door opening that's partially closed and a flat door opening that's partially closed. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if you go to figure 7.6 on page 169, and if we blow that diagram up, what we've got is on the right-hand side are your case scenarios that we just looked at, the 3 of them. And then on the left-hand side, she has posited certain alternative scenarios, which she says are more realistic scenarios, certainly when you get to firefighting, that ought to have been considered.
Are they all realistic, though?
Well, I'll ask you about that in just a moment. Let's take this in stages. Is it right that your scenarios, your leakage paths, only ever assume a window opening of 0.25 metres squared?
Yeah, I was basically making an estimate of what a window that being slightly ajar might be. Yeah, a window that was held open.
And what she's done is you can see in case 1, she's got a much bigger window opening, and case 2, a smaller one.
I think case 1 is where the whole window unit has completely failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and case 2 is her assessment of the window being partially open.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, in case 3, it might look on this diagram like it's the whole wall that's missing, yes? And you say that in your statement last week, you make that point, is that right?
Well, that's how it appears to be drawn.
Yes. But I think if you read, there's some other sections of Dr. Lane's report, and we can clarify this with her tomorrow, but if you look at page 168 and table 7.2, which show her calculations of her 3 different scenarios. In fact, the window area she's got there is NA, not applicable.
Yeah.
And my understanding is the reason for that is that effectively, once your window gets a certain size, it doesn't matter how much bigger it gets, because it's the flat front door that is the governing parameter in terms of leakage.
Well, she's presumed that there is no resistance at all from the opening to outside. That's what the calculation has assumed.
Right. Well,
as far as I can tell anyway.
I think she may disagree with that, but I'll get her to clarify that when she gives evidence tomorrow.
Okay.
If you look at 7.5.20 on page 171, she says 7.520.171 that her final scenario is assuming a flat door opening of 1.4 metres, a kitchen door opening of 1.5, and no restriction by window opening.
Which is what I just said, yeah. Yeah.
But my understanding is that's because it's the flat front door opening of 1.4 metres squared, which is the important figure there. And it doesn't matter if your window is bigger than 1.4 metres squared, it's not going to make any difference. Does that make sense?
True, but I'm not quite sure where she's derived that window being that size from. The way it's drawn, it suggests it's the failure of the whole wall.
No, I appreciate that. Let's go back to figure 7.76 on page 169. Even if we ignore case 3 for a moment in her cases, doesn't this show that there are more realistic case scenarios, certainly once firefighting has begun, which ought to have been calculated?
Well, I think there's lots of scenarios that you could calculate. I wasn't trying to do a detailed analysis of the system. I wasn't trying to justify PSB's system. I was trying to explain the process by which different pathways can emerge and how they interact. So, there's lots of pathways that could emerge.
Now, if we go to figure 7.7 on page 173, here, what...
Could we have a look at the... I think Dr. Lane's got a diagram that shows the wall and how she's calculated the window areas.
We may be able to go to that. I tell you what, let's do that after the lunch break and I can find the paragraph.
This might be a good point, mightn't it?
That sounds like it is a good moment, Mr. Chairman. I'll stop there.
I think it's time we all had a break. Mr. Lay, we're going to stop now so we can all have some lunch. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And as I said to you last time, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. 2:00. Thank you, Miss Grange.
Thank you.
2:00, please.